it was discovered to be this way as opposed to engineered to be this way. It just shows that quantum behavior, useful quantum behavior, can persist in a useful material outside of a cryostat, outside of a vacuum chamber, in something that you can take into a variety of application spaces. Simplicity is good, right? You have something that's kind of not that complicated and works very well. That means good. People can, it maybe still needs an expert to build the system, but it's not some incredibly complicated system to operate and to build. That makes it accessible to lots of people. There's one person you don't want to lie to, and that's yourself. Just know what you really care about and figure that out, right? And then pursue that. So there you go. That's my recommendation to you guys. Don't just interview boomers.
In this episode of the 632 Nanometer podcast, Misha and Mike sit down with Ronald Walsworth, physics professor at the University of Maryland and a leading voice in the development of diamond nitrogen vacancy (NV) centers, one of the few room temperature stable quantum objects known to science. Ron explains how NV centers detect magnetic fields with extraordinary sensitivity and spatial resolution, and unpacks how these tiny defects in diamonds are becoming powerful tools for exploring everything from biology to next-gen electronics to the early solar system. He also talks about the practical side of science, what it takes to turn laboratory breakthroughs into real-world tools, such as the quantum diamond microscope, and the trade-offs involved in commercializing quantum tech and the shifting landscape of academia and entrepreneurship for young researchers.
So we're going to talk a lot about diamonds today. And to me, this topic is quite close and dear, and diamond is definitely one of my best friends. So to start a discussion, so apparently diamond is your best friend as well. So how did you become friends with a diamond?
Well, I've worked on a lot of things over my career because I'm old, but my earliest involvement with doing experiments or thinking about doing science with diamond and with these defects, these nitrogen vacancy or centers, these NV centers in diamond, came from collaborations with my close colleague, Misha Lukin. When I was at Harvard, I was a PI at the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics. I had a part-time faculty position in the physics department, and Misha and I had collaborated on many topics for a number of years since he was a postdoc at ITAMP. I think you've talked to him about some of those things in past conversations. And he and his group were working in 2005 and 6. In addition to collaborations with me, we're using rubidium vapor cells as a way to do electromagnetically induced transparency for slow and stored light and quantum repeater buildups. They were developing capabilities using these NV centers in diamond, thinking of them as a promising platform for quantum information processing. There had been some pioneering work in the late 90s, early 2000s in Germany by Jörg Rochtrup and others who had identified these NV centers as quantum objects, even at room temperature. They single photon emitters, they have quantized energy levels, and you can initialize the electronic spin associated with the NV and read them out. And then there was a flurry of activity over the next 10 years, and Misha got heavily involved in investigating the physics of the NVs. What actually are the energy level structures, and how does all this work? And can you try to make quantum registers or little information processing devices out of them? And a lot of progress was made. He and I had collaboration meetings, and our students would give talks at each other's group. And I remember hearing some talks on NVs and diamond in that 2005 and 6 period from some of his students like Lily Childress and postdoc Gurdev Dutt, Jake Taylor, people like that, who are doing really great work in this area. And then in late 2006, Dima Budker, who was a professor then at Berkeley, he's now in Mainz, and a precision measurement person like me, we're close colleagues and work on very similar things, came to Harvard and gave a seminar. And Misha told me he came by to see Misha at his office, and Misha was telling what was going on with these NVs. And Dima Budker asked him, could you make a magnetometer out of these defects in diamond, right? You're using them for probing other spins inside of diamond. You're playing with them optically in all these interesting ways. Turns out they're kind of annoyingly sensitive to magnetic fields in terms of setting the experiments up. That wasn't what they cared about at that time. And Misha said, maybe. Later he talked to me about this. He said, hey, Ron, what do you think? Would these defects in diamond be useful as a magnetometer? And I said, maybe. And we both went off and thought for a couple days, and then got back together, and we realized, wow, because we thought about potential ways to make this work. It could be very useful, right? Turns out diamond's a very robust material, right? It can go out into extreme high temperatures and high pressures and all sorts of conditions. You can shape it into any condition you want. You can probably pack a lot of these NBs in, not just one. You can make a dense ensemble of them. We could estimate kind of how dense you could make it in practice. If you improve the material properties and the engineering to get longer spin coherence times and better optical collection of the light they emit, wow, maybe we could make a magnetometer in a cubic millimeter of diamond with a lot of NBs that would rival the world's best magnetometers, but not be stuck inside a cryostat like a squid or something like that, right? Or inside of a delicate glass cell. And maybe you could put a dense layer of the NBs just at the surface of a diamond chip and put a sample on top of it. And you could image the light the NBs give off from whatever that sample is that's creating magnetic fields onto a camera and make a two-dimensional image of interesting patterns of fields, whether they're static or time varying. And we should have been thinking, yeah, maybe you could put a single NB super close, a few nanometers from the surface of a diamond, and then put something on the surface like a biomolecule, a protein, or something interesting, and use the NB to do NMR measurements of that molecule. Or you could strongly couple the NB to other spins outside the diamond and use it, again, as a way to transfer quantum states, things like this. So a bunch of ideas flowed out in a few weeks of us thinking about this and these back of the envelope calculations. Then we started getting some of our students and our colleagues involved. Our close colleague, Amir Yacobi, who's a professor there at Harvard, got him involved, and he had his own ideas of, wow, you could maybe make a nanopillar of diamond, put one NB near the surface and scan it over the surface of interesting magnetic materials, right? You could build something very similar to an atomic force microscope, but now it's got a pillar of diamond with this NB, and it would channel the light out and use that to do nanoscale magnetic mapping under a variety of conditions. And I mentioned others like Jake Taylor and Paola Capolaro and Liang Zhang and Lily Childress and a whole series of other people got involved, students and postdocs. And over the spring of 2007, this was all just side projects, right? We wrote up some calculations, figured out a series of measurement protocols the team did, and we had this kind of vision of different things you might be able to do with NBs across all these different sectors in the physical and life sciences and how you might make it all work. So we decided sometime there in probably by mid-2007, I don't remember exactly when, to set up a little demo experiment. And each group, again, it's a side project for all of us. So my group, Misha's group, and Amir's group each contribute some people and some resources to work on the side project. Paul Stamwick's from my group, Jiro Mays, and who was a student, and Jonathan Hodges from Misha's group, and Sung Kung Hong from Amir's group, aided by everybody else. And throughout the mid-late 2007, they did the first demo experiments showing that, yeah, these NBs could be quite good sensors of magnetic fields. And there's this vision of what they might be able to do. And then we report, so that's how I got involved. You asked me this question, I'm giving you the early history. Those results, like the experimental result that looks promising and this vision of what they might do, we reported in 2 papers, right? So the vision paper about the future and calculating what might be possible and all these applications were outlined in a paper that was published in 2008 in Nature Physics. And then the early experimental demo showing you could do sensitive magnetometry and that it's possible with NBs of fields outside of the diamond was published also in 2008 in Nature, right? And meanwhile, we've been in close contact with the German group, Georg Rocktrop and Fedor Jelichko. They were thinking on similar lines. They also did an experimental demo, and we coordinated things so that our 2 papers were submitted to Nature together and then got published together. And then Zoom, the field took off after that because it was really just a mindset switch, right? If you think about what was going on before these demos, and remember I said the NBs are kind of annoyingly sensitive magnetic fields. It's annoying if you're not caring about sensing, if you're caring about doing quantum physics and understanding the NB properties and a quantum information processing, maybe making registers. It takes a mindset switch, and the Dean Booker for us is question being asked was the key mindset switch to think differently. And once you do, you realize, oh my goodness, this could be useful, right? So that's kind of what happened in those early days, and it went pretty quickly. The thinking, the writing up of things. We put in a couple patent applications like late 2007 because we realized it would probably be useful, right? That kind of stuff. So it all went pretty quickly.
Yeah, so it seems like over the past 20 years or so, there have been a lot of demonstrations, a lot of articles published in Nature and Science, and Harvard have been like the hub of the diamond photonics. So which one is like your favorite work or experiment with nitrogen vacancy centers?
I think my favorite thing of what's come out of it so far, there's many cool things. And you mentioned photonics. I want to mention Marco Longcar also. He and his students like Tom Babinek and Birgit Haussmann played a key role in developing some of the ideas that Amir had about scanning diamond nanopillars and a lot of the nanostructures. Hong Kong Park, who got involved in a lot of the early stage and still the demos in the life sciences and other areas, who collaborated a lot with all of us. So there's a lot of people involved. And the Germans groups have been doing amazing things too. So I want to make sure that we spread the love around. There's a lot of great stuff going on all over the place in the field. But my own favorite, because I think the way a lot of progress, kind of interdisciplinary progress, cross-disciplinary progress can happen in science, has to do with the application in earth and planetary sciences, right? And I can tell you a little bit about that because it was unexpected. It's a little bit serendipitous, and yet it ends up being very impactful scientifically. And it would not have been something that any of us physicists would have conceived on our own. It took serendipity and crossing fields to make it happen. So if you'd like, I'll tell you that little tale. Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So early on, as I said, we were thinking about, all of us together, the diversity of applications. It was clear that you could study probably magnetic materials of various kinds, of condensed matter physics problems, and investigate those sorts of things. And there's been a lot that's happened there. We were interested in life science applications too, because diamond's chemically inert. We thought of, we put living creatures on the surface, small living creatures, and map their magnetic fields. Later, temperature too, because the NBs are good thermometers, or NMR of individual proteins or living cells, all that sort of stuff. So we were thinking in that regard. So after the first demos, we started in the different groups building up different experiments, all collaborating, taking kind of some focus for a given group based upon our capabilities. So mine was more focused on ensemble measurements in the imager, the wide field imager, and Misha's was more focused on the single shallow NVs and bulk diamond. And Amir's group was to building up the scanning capabilities, but we're all collaborating, right? And one of the key things in my group, talking with them with collaborators too, is we got to find a low-hanging fruit, something we can do in these early days in the life sciences that's useful, right? So ideally, we want to measure some living something on the surface of the diamond and do magnetic imaging in a way that's useful. It's nice to do technical demos. We're going to do a lot of that, but ideally, we'll actually help answer a particular science problem. And so amongst my group members, in particular, lead thinking about that was an excellent postdoc I had named David Lesage. He'd been trained in Jerry Gabriel's group at Harvard in fundamental precision measurements, and he was a really thorough thinker and developer of techniques. And he began reading the literature and talking to people and trying to find something that would serve, given the early stage of what we could do technically back then, that we can maybe have a life science application. And he found some literature and ended up communicating with a professor at Caltech named Joe Kirscheving, who is a very interesting fellow who both is a leader in studying paleomagnetism in ancient rocks and things like this to learn about the history of the Earth and whatnot, and meteorites. You can learn about the history of the solar system, but also in studying magnetic effects in living creatures, because in some simple living creatures, in bacteria and things like this, they synthesize magnetic nanoparticles, which can then, when they die, go into the Earth and actually be some significant fraction of the magnetism you find in certain types of rocks in the Earth that come from the billions of years of living creatures, some of whom synthesize magnetic particles, believe it or not. And so from this, David, through Joe Kirscheving, both got connected to a professor at Berkeley, Arash Kameli, from whom we then worked on imaging these living magnetotactic bacteria on the surface of diamond. That was demonstrated and published in 2013. So it was an example of actually doing magnetic imaging of living bacteria on the surface of the diamond and learning things about their little chains of magnetic nanoparticles that they naturally synthesize inside their bodies to use as compass needles. So these are bacteria, right? So they're prokaryotes. They have no cell nucleus. They are thought to have evolved about 2 billion years ago. They're common around the world. There's many species of them, but these kind of bacteria. They synthesize chains of magnetic nanoparticles aligned along proteins inside their body and use that as a way to navigate in the Earth's magnetic field. Amazing, right? So they're doing information, they're doing measurement and information processing through physical forces on the protein to solve a problem. And beyond that, the size of magnetic nanoparticles are typically, they're iron-rich grains, slightly above the blocking volume at room temperature, so that the magnetic moments there don't hop around. So they're also solving an advanced physics problem. These 2 billion-year-old creatures are, solving it, right? Not by thinking, but by evolution helping solve it. So we did that demo, but simultaneously, in the contact to Kameli in Berkeley to pursue the life science application, and we were learning new life science things in that demo, and that's why it got published in Nature. Also, Joe Kirshevink had pointed David Lesage towards his former student, Ben Weiss at MIT, who was an expert on using scanning squid magnetometers to study ancient rocks and meteorites. Okay. And Ben had a promising grad student at that time named Roger Thur, who later becomes a professor at Harvard in the Earth and Planetary Science Department at Harvard too. And from the discussions with Ben and Roger and David and the group, we realized that this wide field magnetic imaging ND diamond system, which we often call the quantum diamond microscope or the QDM, might in many ways be better than the squid, because it could, for studying the grains, the small magnetic grains that you see in ancient rocks and meteorites, because it provided much better spatial resolution than the squid, while also providing wide field of view. Now, the spatial resolution can be a fraction of a micron, and you can build some squids that get down to that scale, but because squids are cryogenic, you have to have a standoff distance from the rock that's millimeter scale. Otherwise, you're going to be changing the temperature of the rock and changing its magnetic properties. Because of the innate cryogenic properties of the squid, the detector, you get coarse spatial resolution, and the size of the grains you care about are often tiny fractions of a millimeter, right? They're like 100 micron, tens of microns. So you're losing the information that you'd like to have non-invasively about these small magnetic grains within the larger rock. And it's very important that you see them in this context to solve the scientific problems they're interested in solving about the early Earth's geodynamo and the formation of the solar system. So with those realizations in the discussions, we all realized that we had a tool almost just perfect for addressing some of their major scientific problems with some little tweaks. There was a paper published in Science in 2014, which demoed some of that capability along with using the scanning squids and was addressing a particular scientific question having to do with a particular meteorite, which had grain pieces inside of it that were left over from materials that were there before the formation of the solar system, right? So it incorporated into this meteorite that had fallen to the Earth was very early material that existed going around the early proto-sun before the planets are formed. And by measuring and mapping the magnetic grains inside of these rocks, you're beginning to learn about what the magnetic fields were in the swirling plasma dust disks around the proto-sun that are thought to play a key role in the formation of the planets. Right. Subsequently, since then, a whole series of papers, I've been involved a little bit, right, as the QDM developer, but Roger Fu and other people who are the actual scientists in this field, using this QDM technology to answer a whole bunch of questions in Earth and planetary science, both of those. So, and the key is that QDM provides a window, technical capabilities that they needed and no other tool had. That's not because to recap what I said, not because we knew that building it, it was because of serendipitous connections. So that, and oftentimes I'll say this is my favorite application because it shows the serendipitous applications and shows how you can help leapfrog a certain field. There's now a lot more known about early Earth and early solar system formation because this quantum diamond microscope tool can help. It's not the only tool they use, right? They got to do chemical analysis and isotopic analysis and a lot of other things, but it's a key aid in that science area. So that's my answer to your question. That's my favorite of the many applications because it's highly impactful. And there's an irony that nobody really thought of it ahead of time. It just came through serendipitous interactions.
So are there any insights supporting any theories on the early solar system formation? I would assume, or I have seen the pictures you were sharing, that there is like a distribution of this kind of particles in this rock, and then what is it? It's the magnetic field they induce. It's like induced magnetic fields. So is there any like messages we can get out of this map and the value of the?
Yeah. So again, I'm not an expert in this field. You might want to have Roger on to or Ben Weiss to tell these stories, right? So we're the tool builders who've helped them a little bit in bringing a tool, the quantum diamond microscope, to them. But as I understand it, key aspects are when you're doing the technical, taking the magnetic images and doing the analysis, you want to make sure, let's say in one of these ancient rocks, you know that the rock overall is ancient, but there's very ancient parts, which might be 3-4 billion years old. And you can know some of that through isotopic analysis. And then some of those little tiny grains that might be typically 100 microns in size, that be many little bits incorporated into a much younger rock that might only be 500 million years old, which sounds old, but the tiny fragments left over from the early Earth or the early solar system are distributed in that other rock. Some of those fragments are known to carry, and you can see carry magnetic iron-bearing grains. They're magnetized little grains inside that give off strong magnetic signatures. That's what you want to map. You want to see what's the strength of those little magnetic grains. And then you want to see that their magnetization vectors ideally are not all aligned. If they are all aligned and all the magnetization of the rock's aligned, that tells you that rock's been reheated to very high temperatures and everything's just gotten magnetized. It's like erasing a hard disk. You've lost the information of what happened when the grains were first formed. Many of those iron-bearing grains have very high Curie points, over 1,000 degrees C. So once they solidify, cool down a little bit, they get magnetized, give off a magnetic field. Could have happened long ago in the early solar system, early Earth, then later get incorporated into rocks. And if they all have about the same magnitude of magnetic field, my fingers are indicating they're different directions, but are random in orientation, that is a strong argument together with other pieces of evidence that the magnetic fields you are measuring from these grains tell you about the magnetic fields that they were exposed to at the time when they solidified and went down below the Curie point and got magnetized. And from that, you can learn things like where's the distribution of the crustal plates in the early Earth, what is the timescale of the geodynamos evolution in the early Earth, and also in the solar system, as I was mentioning before, the swirling plasma dust disk, which was electrically charged, so had electrical currents and was generating magnetic fields. What were the magnetic fields as a function of position away from the early sun and time? 2 million years ago, 2 million years after the sun began its gravitational collapse, 3 million, 4 million. So very early, right? Really early in the formation of the solar system. I'm told that leading theories say that the magnetic properties that come from the plasma dust disk swirling around the early sun, same thing would be true in other solar systems, I guess, could lead to magnetohydrodynamic modes, which lead to concentrations of particulate matter in certain positions away from the early sun, which then leads to gravitational collection and a feedback loop that could serve as the seeding points for the planets, what become the planet, or the planetoid, the bigger and bigger chunks that then begin merging. So that's the tale. That's the story, where the takeaway is that magnetic fields from certain grains in rocks and meteorites are time machines. They're recorders of the very early part of our planet's history, and even before our planet existed, our solar system history. That's really cool. I'm not saying that ironically, it's about the real world, but it's not what we mean by real world applications, right? It's about our planet and our solar system. Really cool, right? And to have played a small role in helping give a tool to a community of scientists who are using that tool to learn about these sorts of things. I think that's why it's my favorite application.
Just going back to the basics, I guess one thing that we should cover is, and it's good for me because I'm not Misha has worked a lot with NV centers, but I haven't. So what's the physics behind the sensitivity to magnetism?
Right.
And what's the setup? Like, what does the microscope really look like? What's the implementation?
Right. So nitrogen vacancy centers in diamond are one of many examples of small crystal defects in the crystal of materials. Diamond is one, Diamond's a large, my hands are indicating band gap. It's a large band gap semiconductor, about 5.5 electron volts between the valence band and the conduction band. For physicists listening, that means there's a very large energy gap in which the excitations of the carbon nuclei, which make up diamond, the carbon atoms, which make up diamond, the electronic excitations, they're all either down here or up here, and the huge range, if something is energetically in there, it's going to be decoupled from the electronic excitations in the carbon lattice. So diamond, that large band gap is related to some of its other properties, its hardness, and they're both related to each other. They're interrelated, hardness and transparency and other kinds of things. It turns out that amongst these many defects that can exist in diamond and in silicon carbide and other semiconductors, the NV is amongst the most favorable in that the corruption in the lattice is associated with essentially electrons that are trapped there. The simple way, the many-body effect to properly describe it, but let's just think about it simply. Normally, you'd have a carbon lattice, particular two FCC face-centered cubic lattices that are offset by a lattice position to make up diamond. Now, let's take two neighboring carbon atoms. One gets replaced by a nitrogen, that's the N in the NV. One gets replaced by nothing, a vacancy, that's the V in the NV. It's a fairly common defect because N, nitrogen, is right next to carbon on the periodic table, and N, nitrogen, is quite common in the environment. So naturally occurring diamonds will sometimes have these NVs, and diamonds that are fabricated in laboratories for use for technical applications, which we mostly use for NV sensing, can also have NVs. You can control in the fabricated diamonds the density of them. But this nitrogen is one more on the periodic table than carbon. So there's, it's 7 atomic number instead of 6, that kind of thing, right? So you have one extra electron relative to the carbon that was there that's been substituted. It's also energetically favorable for for an extra electron, and there are a few extra electrons in the lattice, to be attracted to the NV0 and then become an NV minus. So if you think about the NV as having 2 extra electrons compared to if it was a carbon sitting there, the extra nitrogen electron and the extra electron from the lattice, you end up having 2 electrons trapped in that vacancy, right where that vacancy is. Those carbon atoms are around it, and they have that big band gap. They're rigidly held there. The electrons can't interact very easily at thermal temperatures with those electron excitations. The electrons interact a little bit and overlap some with the nitrogen that's there, so there'll be a hyperfine interaction, but it's kind of like a trap for 2 electrons, right? A trap for 2 electrons, a little atomic scale trap. And so if you did your Schrodinger equation simplistically for some particle in a box, you'd get quantized energy levels. In this case, it's more complicated, a many-body system, and the wave function shape is a little bit complicated, but it's conceptually similar. It's like particles in a box, but 2 electrons, right? That means it'll have quantized energy levels. Those electrons will. They'll have electronic spin quantum number because they're 2 electrons, S equal 1, right? Which means they'll have sublevels ms equal plus and minus 1 and ms equals 0. These 2 levels will shift rapidly, their energy levels of the ms equal plus and minus 1 with applied magnetic field. Because they are electrons with a Bohr magneton magnetic moment, you have a very rapid change of energy levels with magnetic field. That's the source of the magnetic field sensitivity. The ms equals 0 level, down here, this finger, doesn't shift with applied magnetic field because it has no longitudinal, it's the ms equals 0 level, so no longitudinal magnetic angular momentum. But it's offset in energy using frequency units by close to 3 gigahertz, 2.87 gigahertz from these 2 levels, which are also shift, because you can think of it as the magnetic dipole-dipole interaction of the 2 electrons that are trapped in there. That dipole interaction shifts these levels, and then any applied magnetic field leads to a Zeeman shift. Okay? So now, so you can see, all right, there'd be these things. Rather than a nucleus with electrons around them, it's a trap with electrons inside. You can kind of understand how they'd have some sort of quantized energy levels, and you can understand how you might get magnetic field shifting. Okay. All right, great. Then how do you make magnetic field measurements with these things? Well, you're doing what's called optically detected magnetic resonance in some variation of that. There's a whole bunch of measurement protocols that we're not going to go into all of them here, depending on the type of magnetic field you want to sense. By the way, this level here, the splitting between this guy and these will shift with temperature or electric field, so you can also use it as sensors of those things too, and with pressure. but let's stick to magnetic fields. The optically detected magnetic resonance, ODMR, that means you can optically detect or optically read out the splittings between the m is equal to 0 and this level or this level, right? And from that, you could do magnetometry because you can see.
It's a fluorescence measurement, basically.
It's a fluorescence, or since it's in a solid, the different word they use is photoluminescence, but it's basically the same thing. If you apply green light to the NV, it'll absorb the green light and fluoresce down in the red. So different wavelengths going in and out because it is in a solid, and the solid is shaking, and that tends to shift the wavelengths of what's emitted versus what's absorbed. But also what happens, in addition to absorb green, red, green in, red out, these levels in the excited state have some probability, about 50%, to decay down to this level. All right. And so it means if you leave the green light on for a little while, you polarize, or you pump the NVs into this level near 100%. And then if you drive microwave signals on to try to undergo the transition from this level to either this one or this one, they're at different frequencies, then you can get spectra in the optical emission, because when you're driving, let's say from this level to this level, in the presence of green light, that will lead you to go into this state with some probability the microwaves will. The green light will send you over around this pathway, which doesn't emit as much red, right? If you're in this level, right, if you're off resonance and the microwaves are off resonance, you'll just be absorbing green and emitting red. So you'll have high fluorescence, photoluminescence emission. Once the microwaves are on resonance with this transition here to here, you'll get briefly stuck going this way, and the photoluminescence will drop. And so you can map on a nice resonance curve, first from this one to this one, and at a different frequency, this one to this one, and the dips in this photoluminescence in the presence of the amount of red that's coming out as a function of red, as a function of green, microwave frequency. You see these nice dips, and the separation of the dips, they're very sharp peaks, changes with the magnetic field. So you're really just doing a spectroscopy, a magnetic resonance spectroscopy, but optically detected, as opposed to, let's say, NMR or something like this, where you're doing magnetic resonance, but it spins, doing Faraday induction through a coil and measuring a voltage. But because you can do it on one ND quite sensitively, you can do nanoscale sensing. If you put an ensemble of NDs, you lose a little spatial resolution, but you can still get many more photons out and do much more sensitive measurements, like in a little volume, right? Let's say you had a cubic micron with 10 to the 6 or 10 to the 9, 10 to the 6 NVs, let's say, in a cubic micron. That's a big increase in the number of photons that are being emitted versus one NV. That'll give you better signals to noise and a more sensitive measurement. Now you're only doing it on a cubic micron, so that's your spatial volume averaging rather than a nanoscale measurement with a single NV. So there's a trade-off of spatial resolution with sensitivity, that kind of thing. But for many applications, one NV is fine. For other ones, you want this high density ensemble. But hopefully that gives, for physicists who enjoy my fingers and all that kind of thing, moving around, hopefully that gives everyone a sense of how you do magnetic sensing. It's basically energy levels, quantized energy levels that shift around rapidly with magnetic field that you can initialize and read out optically. Yeah, the same behavior happens in other defects too, right? In diamond and other materials. It's just, it tends to happen better in the NV at room temperature, ambient conditions, than some of the other defects, because the NV is particularly nicely located in the band gap, and its spin orbit coupling is due to kind of accidental cancellations, is just enough to give you this decay pathway that gives spin polarization, but not so rapid that you end up having the vibrations at thermal energies, making your spin polarization decay too rapid.
Yeah, I feel like when I also worked with envy, it's like nature's present for like a gift for a physicist, because it's like everything is aligned in a way that this is the system where even at ambient conditions you can see the quantum effects.
Yeah,
I think
exactly.
which is very rare in general, like for quantum system, because usually you need to cool down to preserve the quantum coherence, but somehow magically in color centers, like the coherence of those like magnetic states is preserved for quite a long time, and I don't know. So
it's fortuitous. It's not because there are. I'll repeat what I said. There are many of these defects in diamond and other materials, and people had studied them because they give color to gems and all sorts of reasons for many years. And some are qualitatively similar to the NBs. There's other kinds of behavior, but generally what you said is exactly right. Quantum behavior, quantized energy levels, long coherence times, being able to spin, polarize, all that stuff will become prominent and significant when you cool down to cryogenic temperatures. A few of the defects, and the NV most prominently, there's cancellation of effects to some degree that compensate each other and allow the, you have just enough spin or coupling to polarize, but not too much to have spin decay and all that kind of thing. It's because of a cancellation of factors that amongst all the hundreds, this one has the best of these features, right? So at least so far, people are working hard to investigate other defects in a variety of materials because the NVs is not the end of the story. But it does show, I think, more than anything, it just shows, and it was discovered to be this way as opposed to engineered to be this way. It just shows that quantum behavior, useful quantum behavior, can persist in a useful material outside of a cryostat, outside of a vacuum chamber, in something that you can take into in a variety of application spaces. Even at elevated temperatures, we've seen up to about 500 degrees Celsius, the NV can still behavior degrades a little bit, but can still do useful magnetic sensing. Under very high pressures, some people like Norman Yao at Harvard have used NVs inside of diamond anvil cells, which also use diamond to put high pressure to do pressure sensing at extreme pressures. And Michael, you asked, I didn't answer your question about the setups,
I think I came up with one more question while you were talking. Yeah. What's the temperature stability that's needed to get, the type of sensitivity that you needed, let's say for the geologists or for biology or any other use case? Like how stable does the temperature have to be?
Great question, because remember way back when at the beginning, I was saying, this annoying sensitivity to magnetic fields and things kind of led to the thinking about, well, maybe it actually could flip it around to be a sensor, but you want to be able to be sensitive to the things you care about in a given experiment, not the things you don't care about. So as a thermometer, back to my fingers, this is the magnetic field splitting, here's the MS equals 0. It's not this splitting, it's the splitting between the MS equals 0 and the plus or minus 1 that will shift with temperature. Simplistically, you can think of, let's say you warm the diamond lattice up, it expands a little bit, which means the dipolar interaction between the two electrons that are trapped inside the diamond is a little bit less, because on average they're farther apart, which means the splitting will shift this way, or it'll get a little bit less, not broaden, get a little bit this way. If you cool down, it'll go the other way, that kind of thing. That temperature sensitivity is real there. It's non-zero, it's measurable, but it's sort of like, again, kind of fortuitously in an in-between level, such that it can be useful as a thermometer in certain applications, not the most sensitive thermometer, but an okay thermometer, but with high spatial resolution, like in little nanodiamonds put inside of living creatures or in microfluidics. But given the high thermal conductivity of diamond, if you're doing some of the measurements with the microscope, which has a macroscopic chunk of diamond that's like a microscope slide, diamond has a very good thermal conductivity and a high heat capacity. So what will end up happening is it'll be very homogeneous in temperature. And as long as you have on some substrate, the amount of heat you'd have to apply to significantly warm it, the diamond I'm talking about, to make this energy level shifting, make you confused with the thing you care about for magnetometry, would be very extreme. So therefore, it's usually not a problem. Right? I'm not saying it's something you completely ignore as one of the many technical considerations that come into building a useful system, just like vibration. Do you want your microscope slide or whatever you're using flopping all over the place? No, you want a secure mount. You want to have reasonable thermal connection so that heat can get out. You have to put the light in the right way and do all these things properly, but it's not a showstopper. In terms of the instrumentation, if you're just doing this quantum diamond microscope, the wide field imager, it's a remarkably simple setup. It's got this microscope slide like a diamond with a dense layer of NVs. Most of the diamond has no NVs in it, maybe a micron thick layer or something like this. You can grow the diamonds to have the NVs where you want them. You have to have optics to bring the green light in, optics to collect the red light. Each little region of the diamond will be emitting red light from its NVs, and you image it through good optics onto a camera so that pixels on the camera correspond to regions on the diamond. But that technology exists and can be developed. You want to apply a bias static magnetic field under your control, so you can choose which of the NVs within the diamond you're selecting. I haven't mentioned it, but a diamond has 4 crystallographic axes. The NVs will typically be equally populating all these axes. Any one NV is along any one axis, but statistically there's an ensemble. You get equal amounts on all 4. And then the energy level shifts, back to the fingers again, are dependent upon the magnetic field component along each of the axes. So any one of the 4 classes of NVs will give you the component of the magnetic field along those 4 directions. 4 pieces of information over determines the 3 that you need for vector sensing, so you can get magnitude and also direction of the magnetic field by doing the measurements correctly. So you want some sort of bias field, usually with a little electromagnet or magnets, kind of simple, some proper mount.
So the biased field allows you to know which way each NV is oriented?
Right. Or let's say change the direction of the bias field so that you're selecting out one of the 4 crystallographic axes or for some other purpose, right? So usually it's a few tens of Gauss field that might get used. You can use higher or lower if you want, but it's usually a relatively easy to apply field with relatively simple apparatus. A mount, the data is the rate of red photons that are coming out from the photoluminescence as a function of the experimental protocols. Remember the microwaves to drive the spin transitions. You usually have an antenna to apply them, properly mounted, and a source of microwaves that you can control for the different measurement protocols. Some sort of computer to analyze the data, things like this, but nothing super fancy. So I'm kind of emphasizing simplicity for a reason. Simplicity is good, right? You have something that's kind of not that complicated and works very well. That means good. It maybe still needs an expert to build the system, but it's not some incredibly complicated system to operate and to build. That makes it accessible to lots of people. Now, NVs, if you're talking about the scanning measurements I was mentioning before to get few nanometer spatial resolution maps of magnetic materials, like Amir Yacobi's ideas to do that sort of thing, things like that. And others were like Christian Dagan was thinking about similar ideas back in 2007 and 8 too, independently. Wonderful work happened by him as well. That needs a vacuum chamber, right? To keep things properly isolated. Typically, and to keep the surfaces clean and be able to get this atomic force microscopy like control using piezos. Sometimes you'll want to be doing measurements at low temperature, not because the NV is needed, but because the sample that you're studying, it exhibits its interesting behavior at low temperatures. So usually those scanning nanoscale measurements, the apparatus is a bit more complicated, right? It's like 3, 4, or 5 times more complicated and more expensive or something than the wide field imager I was discussing, but it's not that bad. And commercial systems now, both for the QDMs, the kind of simple apparatus, and the scanning devices exist. There's multiple companies. I've founded a couple of them that make some of these instruments. Other people have been involved as well as developing them. So they've spun out of academic labs, and the technology is increasingly accessible, not just to the physicists, but to the geoscientists and the life scientists and others who want to use it for their various applications.
Ron, so you mentioned that for the QDMs, you're using like a diamond plate with arrays of NV centers. So you were saying that it's essentially like matching the position of the color center with the pixel on the camera. Do you also leverage the kind of super resolution approaches by taking into account that it emits from...
there has been some work there. I'll describe it. First, I'm going to give you an image of the NVs arrayed on the diamond that is incorrect, and then we'll discuss it. Like think of a checkerboard, with nice squares in a checkerboard. Imagine one NV in each position on a checkerboard, so you have a 2-dimensional array of them, right? That's in people's minds, or some cartoons you might think of them arrayed that way. That would be wonderful if we could create them a checkerboard like that, especially if we could control the separation between every NV to be very, very with high precision, right? And especially if you could get them within few nanometers of each other. Then you'd have this strongly coupled, magnetic dipole coupled array, and you might make a scalable quantum information processing quantum computer platform. And some of the original visions and hope was that would be possible. It isn't yet possible, perhaps will never be possible, to control the positions of the NVs created in the diamond with that level of precision, i.e., I want it only at that lattice site in the diamond. Maybe I can have a straggle of one lattice site, but I don't I want to really control where the NVs are located. It doesn't work that way. It's statistically created. The NVs are inside the diamond with a variety of techniques, either grown during the chemical vapor deposition growth process or implanted with ions. And you can control, on average, the density of the NVs and on average how far below the surface they are. But there'll be a range, a statistical distribution. So in the quantum diamond microscope, the microscope slide version where there's just NVs at the surface, I said it might be a micron thick layer, right? It might be, or 5 micron thick layer or something. That's an average depth. And the density you can control, and typically we'll have the density of the NVs for the microscopes much closer than the optical diffraction limit, by some tens of nanometers to 100 nanometer on average apart, but they're straggled. They're not all in a regular checkerboard. It's not regularly arrayed. So think of it as just a kind of random array, but on average, you know what the density is. Okay, right. So that's what that layer is like. That's why for some of the quantum computing applications or quantum information applications, you're thinking about scaling, the inability to do like what you do in the other platforms. Ions can be controlled where they are. Rydberg atom arrays can be put in a nice array. Superconducting qubits can be aligned to be separated the right distance from each other. The defects in diamond are randomly oriented with an average separation, not a controlled separation. It means huge heterogeneity in couplings.
Could you produce nanoparticles that either have one or no defects, basically like a Poisson distribution?
Yeah. And also I'll answer that and also get back to super resolution. So super resolution is an optical, what people usually mean is optical imaging when you get around the diffraction limit. Diffraction limit for visible wavelength light is going to give you something like 300 nanometer spatial resolution, something like that, right? There are super resolution techniques that have been developed over the years, like Stefan Hell developed the STED family of techniques, and others developed the other techniques for storm and whatnot, and other sorts of people. So you have we've been able to implement those super resolution techniques with NVs. We actually collaborated, Misha and I did with Stefan Hell for some years, expert, and NVs are quite good because they're unlike a lot of the super resolution targets in the life sciences, which are molecules that bleach after intense laser illumination. NVs tend not to bleach. They stay pretty stable as long as you don't super zap them and drive that second electron off. They stay NV minuses. So you've been able to use these super resolution techniques to localize individual NV positions down to around 10, even a little bit better than 10 nanometers. That's localizing their position. And then also run the magnetic measurement protocols, these ODMR-like protocols to measure the magnetic fields nearby. So you can both localize a single NV and measure magnetic fields locally with it. Another way to do super resolution, I'm putting a quotation mark, is a nanostructure, a nanodiamond, Michael, like you're saying. Now you have a physical object that might be 30 nanometers in size or whatever. And if you can control that there's one NV in there, or two, maybe whatever, just to give you signal, and you know where that nanodiamond is, then you know that the signal that you're getting, say for magnetic field measurements or temperature measurements, are coming from wherever that nanodiamond is. So that's not what people typically mean by super resolution, but it is a way to get nanoscale information. Another is the scanning method I told you about before, where the NV is right near the surface of the nanopillar, and you can bring it into proximity, and you know where the nanopillar is by position, by its physical structure, and you calibrated things, you know the relative position of the nanostructure, and you get information that way. And yet another super resolution technique, the last one maybe I'll talk about, is a spin-off of the ideas of how you can do very high spatial resolution nuclear magnetic resonance imaging in things like human bodies, i.e. MRI. People think of MRI, magnetic resonance imaging. You often get sub-millimeter spatial resolution, even though the wavelengths of the radio frequency fields that are being sent off by the nuclear spins are meters. So the wavelengths are meters or longer, and yet you're getting sub-millimeter spatial resolution. How do you do that? You do that because you're not trying to do optics with the radio frequency information. You're actually collecting it from a whole region of the body, all the signal. You're getting spatial information by using magnetic field gradients that you intentionally apply across the object to be sensed to take the nuclear spins, tip them in the transverse plane, and then the magnetic field gradients will, I'll do it like this, create a spatial modulation in the phase as a function of position. That spatial modulation in phase then will give you a signal amplitude if there's a spatial modulation in the object you want to detect, which will give you essentially a piece of data, a non-zero signal that will give you essentially the Fourier component of the spatial information you're interested in. So rather than real space, you're getting it in K space, and then you apply a series of these gradients and you take images in K space, do a Fourier transform, and it can give you an image in real space. And you're not limited by optical diffraction that limits normal imaging. You're limited by other phenomena like spin diffusion and the strength of gradients you can apply and things like that. So we applied those same sort of techniques to NVs, and NVs aren't nuclear spins, they're electronic spins. So they have 1,000-fold larger magnetic moment. So the gradients you can apply over very small little sub-millimeter objects is much larger than you can against a big meter scale object like a human body, just practically. So you can get larger gradients, 1,000-fold larger magnetic moments, which means you can have much higher wave number, much higher values in K space, i.e. much smaller spatial resolution by doing this kind of Fourier imaging. And we were able to get down to single-digit nanometer spatial localization using this Fourier imaging technique. And again, in addition to localizing the NVs, sense with them locally. So look at that. There's optical super resolution. We've done that. There's this Fourier magnetic imaging MRI type super resolution. We've done that. There's constraining the NVs inside a nanodiamond or a nanoscale probe. That's another way to get high spatial resolution. And there's others. So that's a lot of the technical development in the last 15 years has been in things like improving spatial resolution, improving sensitivity by how do you make the coherence times longer? How do you collect more of the light? How do you keep the NVs having very good properties? And then also pursuing all these many applications, and we've hit on a few.
In the commercial applications of the quantum diamond microscope, what is the what is the resolution? Because I understand, like for NVs, the killer advantage is the spatial resolution comparing to any other sensing systems.
Yeah, I'd say the killer application for NVs is spatial resolution. Three things, maybe. Spatial resolution, its ability to operate in wide ranges of conditions, even extreme conditions because of the diamond host. And this vector sensing capability along the axes, which is built into the crystal. And so it has very low drift. You're always going to be able to do a vector measurement. The crystal is in itself like a glass. It's not evolving. It's fixed. And so you have a kind of a system that does not need much recalibration. But for the microscopy, yes, various forms of microscopy, micron scale, nanoscale. That's a lot of the applications are that. So for the QDMs, the ones that are being sold by a company that Roger Fu and I founded called QDMIO, the spatial resolution there depends upon which diamond you choose and what's the density, the thickness of the NV layer. Different diamonds are grown with different NV layers, like I said, although they're statistical in terms of the distribution of the NVs. You might have a 100 nanometer layer, a 1 micron layer, a 5 micron layer, a 10 micron layer, and you might have a series of diamonds that have these different layer thicknesses. Why do you want different diamonds with different layer thicknesses? You want to tune the diamond or choose the diamond that's appropriate for the measurement at hand, right? The more NVs you get, so the thicker the layer, the more light it's giving off, and the better the sensitivity. So that's good. You like better sensitivity. On the other hand, if you make the layer too thick relative to the features, the two-dimensional features you're trying to measure in a rock or something like this, the magnetic fields from those little features will start going deep inside the diamond and overlapping into different areas of the NVs in the diamond, and you'll blur out the image. You'll have NVs are 10 microns deep. If you've got half micron features on the surface, those magnetic fields from that half micron feature are going across a lot of different NVs, and you're not going to be able to sharply image the magnetic image. So typically the rule of thumb is layer thickness of NV should be equal to the smallest feature size you want to detect, magnetically image. So a common thing for some of the rocks might be 5 micron or 10 micron layer thickness, because the typical feature sizes are tens of microns to hundreds of microns. They usually don't need to see smaller than that. If you were back to those magnetotactic bacteria measurements I was talking about some time ago, those little bacteria are like 2 microns long. Those little change of magnetic nanoparticles, or the whole chain is maybe 1 micron. So you want as good spatial resolution as you can get. You're limited by optical diffraction unless you use the super resolution techniques. So you use a very, very thin NV layer that might be a couple hundred nanometers, and and get like 300 or 400 nanometer spatial resolution, something like that. So it depends on your application.
And how fast you can collect the images? Is it like a confocal scanning, or is this a one-shot image?
Yeah, so it's a wide field under the camera, so you're not scanning typically, and so you're accumulating data from all regions of the field of view simultaneously. And so the data comes in, the measurement protocols are quite fast. There is typically one measurement protocol, one run of the measurements, given the coherence times and depolarization times and optical pumping times are on the order of milliseconds. You might take several of those snapshots on that time scale if you want a signal average to get better signal to noise and sensitivity per pixel. It depends on the strength of the field. So if you have a spatial pattern of magnetic fields and they're very strong fields, a single shot might be fine. And within a few milliseconds or something, you have an image, that's fine. Often you might update it every second or two with a bunch of signal averaging and let the signal become crisper with better, less noise on it. So it depends. If it's a very weak signal, like some of the biological signals are very weak, then you typically are signal averaging. You often signal average for tens of minutes or even hours to get better and better SNR. Then you have a challenge. Is my biological system changing in some way, right? So there's different extremes. In one level, you can do kind of snap, like video, rapid, and time. You can see time changes in the images if the strength of the fields is large enough. Every few milliseconds, you can get an image. In another case, you're averaging for hours for some super tiny signal as long as it's stable. But usually it's seconds to minute to kind of get a nice, useful image.
And from application point of view, so you mentioned that it has been used, it seems like at the academic university research, but beyond that, what is currently like the sector which is primarily interested in these microscopes?
Yeah, so for the microscope, an example of a sector people care about is in electronic systems, right? Where you can see electrical currents flowing through integrated circuits or other kinds of batteries, other kinds of electronic systems. You can also see magnetization, magnetic fields that come from the magnetization of solder balls and other kinds of objects inside. And since magnetic fields generally pass through most objects unperturbed, unless you have some magnetic shielding there, typically magnetic fields are pretty high fidelity carriers of information. Again, think about MRI from your body. These radio frequency magnetic fields are passing out and carry all this information. So a lot of people are interested in non-invasively looking inside of electronic systems, either when they're already functional, and now you want to see whether there's some flaw inside. Maybe there's been an error in the electronic system. During the fabrication of the electronic system, before you can apply power to it or whatever, you might look at the transient currents that can exist or magnetization distributions to be able to see whether each layer of the electronic system has been assembled correctly so you can have good quality control. Or you may want to be able to look inside of some system that you think is functioning properly, but maybe somebody has put a so-called Trojan inside your chip, right? Something is little programs running in there that you want to know is there. So this high spatial resolution ability to map currents flowing and magnetizations inside of electronics, often non-invasively, is of a lot of interest to people. There are other kinds of systems, so that's one example, where people are interested in doing sensitive analysis of materials that might have, again, to understand whether they are failing or not. This could be like embrittlement of materials that have been exposed to radiation or extreme conditions. So it's a kind of analysis tool, that kind of thing. And so there's companies and interests in the nuclear industry and others who are interested in those sorts of applications, right? And then there's the biomedical applications too. So a company that Misha Lukin and a business partner Misha Lukin and I, and business partner, founded some more than 10 years ago, called QDTI, uses this basic QDM technology, but optimized for analyzing biomedical samples for looking at diagnostics. There are magnetic signatures that you can take magnetic nanoparticles and label them to selectively find biomarkers of interest, like some tumor cell you might have in your blood or some other biomarker about some head trauma or something like this, right? If you can selectively label those biomarkers with magnetic signatures, and you'll only get you can distinguish when the magnetic nanoparticles are labeled or not labeled, So you can tell whether you have labeled something or you haven't labeled something. You can do a remarkably good job with this kind of technology in seeing like one biomarker in a macroscopic biosample like blood or some other biosample. And so there's yet another commercial application that's being pursued. So electronics, material characterization, medical diagnostics, those are some examples.
So for medical diagnostics, is it mostly, I understand it's like in vitro, kind of you need to take like a tissue or biopsy?
Yeah, you like take a blood sample or something out,
sample.
and then it's like a tabletop diagnostic tool, right? Yep. But could you imagine other things like we can imagine all sorts of things. So if we think about the future, maybe whether with NVs and diamond or some similar technology, a wand that could look for surface effects either on the skin or elsewhere in the body that might be detectable, that could be signs of some early disease or something like that. People have looked into being able to detect signals that come from brains or other electrically active cells. That's already can be done nicely with very, very sensitive optically pumped magnetometers that use warm atomic vapor, and also with squid arrays. Those systems are sensitive enough to detect brain signals outside the skull. So not, neural link kind of things, no penetrations, just an array of detectors, my fingers indicating outside the skull. And that's useful for disease diagnosis too, and understanding doing psychology experiments and things like this, and possibly for mind-machine interfaces. However, those existing technologies, squids and OPMs, they're very sensitive, but they typically need to be operated under very small, very tightly controlled conditions, often inside of shielded rooms. They can't handle large dynamic range of background fields and electromagnetic interference. NVs in principle can handle that kind of thing. They tend not to be quite as sensitive yet, but if the sensitivity for the bulk magnetometers with NVs can be improved, they might be a better approach for either brain, heart, other kinds of electrically active parts of the body.
Yeah, it is really fascinating that you've been translating the research discoveries and developments into commercial products. And what kind of challenges usually happen when you do that?
All sorts of things. I'm an academic, right? So I have been involved in startups and commercialization, but I'm not the person who leads the companies. I try to help them go and get them started. I find it enjoyable from a technical point of view to think about different types of technical challenges. If you're working on basic physics problems, you want to do some fundamental symmetry test or study some magnetic material or something. You have cold atoms, whatever it might be. You have certain challenges, and to realize that experiment, there's the physics challenges, the physics you want to see, and the effects you don't want to see, and then the engineering challenges for an experimentalist to engineer your system to give you the right kind of sensitivity for the phenomena you want to study, all that kind of thing. If you're making a commercial product, it's a whole different set of challenges, but still technical, but from a different point of view. Things you might not care about as an academic now become very important. Can these different components in your setup now be engineered to work well together in a small box that can resist some sort of level of shaking or other environmental challenge? You might not care in a lab. Yeah, I could just put them in a rack or separate them. What's the big deal? But to make something operate in a small form factor at a relatively low cost, to be able to operate well enough to both do the job people care about, but also operate in the kind of environment they have, so that's a whole bunch of different technical challenges that I do find interesting. And some of the translation challenge is related to that, like things which are really awesome and work well in academic settings either won't work well enough probably for a commercial product because they improve one thing a lot and the academics are focused on that, but they make several other things not as good, right? They're really expensive, or it's really delicate, or you need a highly paid expert or something like this to operate it. People say it's just not worth it, right? And so thinking even before you start going on the commercial side about the trade-offs and whether a certain technology will have legs and satisfy some need that somebody has is outside of the business. It's important for business, but it's also technically it's quite interesting to think about these kind of trade-offs. It gives you a new set of problems to look at, right? So again, it's a mind shift. You have to care enough to think about those sorts of things. And I find it interesting to think about different kinds of problems from different sorts of angles. It's also why I like, though I'm very much a precision measurement person who comes from the AMO community, that's what I'll always be. I like being able to work across disciplines in other fields too, often like the story in the Earth and planetary science field or some of these other things, hopefully bringing a technology or capability to some other people that they can use. And then from them, I get the gift of learning. I get to learn something about their field, right? And they get to learn a little bit of what we can do. And I've found that kind of going up the learning curve, somewhere about halfway up is where some of the best ideas happen. You know enough to not just have dumb ideas, but there's still things you haven't figured out, so you can ask these sort of questions. And that's where a fertile interaction happens. In commercialization too, as you're moving to try to translate a technology, you might think you know what the application is, but as you develop it, you realize, oh, this thing we thought was annoying, turns out to be the thing that's where the real value is added. So
I was just going to ask two questions, actually. One was, I saw just going through your background that you had worked with quantum sci, the QSci chip. It seems like maybe it could be like a detector for NV centers. Like if you deposit a diamond on that chip or something like that, or bonded it to a diamond.
I haven't thought about that. I'm not sure, but it's for proteomics, right? That's a technology. So, it's not really. I think the word quantum got into the title.
Oh yeah, but I meant because it's like the chip is like, it's a camera. It's a CCD camera with waveguides that deliver, I think, green light, maybe. I don't know what they call. I don't know what the wavelength is, but
there is some similarity, but it's highly with a bunch of
maybe it's blue light
micro wells to be able as they snip up the bunch of the proteins, and then they can study the bits and pieces in these arrays, and then statistically figure out from how things what they find, not just in one run, but many runs, what the reconstruct with some prior knowledge what the protein structure was. So QSci or Quantum SI is a now public company. I served on the advisory board for like a year or two, and at its beginning, as did others like Hong Park and Mark Aloncar, I mentioned, and Adam Cohen and some other folks. There were three companies I was involved with, which all came out of a focused incubator called 4Catalyzer. They're a wealthy serial entrepreneur named Jonathan Rothberg, who had played a key role in driving down the cost of a lot of gene sequencing. So gene sequencing on a chip, he and his previous companies, 454 and Ion Torrent and whatever, had played a key role in that sort of thing. He made money in these areas and wanted his next round of companies to be in similarly kind of disrupting and driving down the cost of diagnostic tools, imaging tools, et cetera, medical diagnostics. So the three companies I was involved with, one I was a co-founder of, and the other two I was advisor of. The QSci was one I was an advisor of. The other one I was advisor of is called Butterfly Network, that makes handheld low-cost ultrasounds for being able to do ultrasound. There it's ultrasound on a chip. Again, it's capacitively machined ultrasound transducers that can both emit ultrasound and then detect the signals and process them on the chip. Conventional ultrasounds have piezoelectric crystals that create the signal, detect, and et cetera, and usually on a larger card. So few $1,000 handheld ultrasounds. That's a public company now too, and is doing pretty well. And the company that I co-founded is a company called Hyperfine. It was low-cost portable MRI machines. So it was myself, Matt Rosen, a former postdoc of mine who is a PI, a professor at Harvard Medical School and Mass General Hospital, it was technology we were starting in my physics lab back in the late 90s of how to make low magnetic field, simpler MRI machines. We ended up building our own home-built human MRI machine in my physics lab in the early 2000s, but low magnetic field one you could walk in and you could do an MRI standing up or lying down, but not at that time of protons in the body, but of inhaled hyperpolarized gases, noble gases, helium-3 and xenon-129. You could image the lung, watch the gases in xenon into the blood flow.
Helium-3, you said? Because helium-3 sounds like a rare material.
We were imaging helium-3 in the lungs and doing all this sort of stuff. Then when Matt set up his lab, he made other major advances to be able to do pretty good imaging at low field of protons in the body, like brains and things like this. And then the company got started in 2014, and now it's an FDA-approved portable MRI machines. The company did an amazing job in developing truly portable, small MRI machines. They operate at low magnetic field that can go into patients' rooms, in emergency rooms, and intensive care units, It can operate off of batteries and can go in developing countries. You don't need experts to operate. It doesn't need cryogenics, all that sort of stuff. So that's an example of took a long time from the 90s to today to have this technology translation happen. And it was Rothberg and the people in the companies and Matt, his work at Mass General Hospital more than me. I kind of got it started in the early days, but it gave me a taste of what's needed, this whole journey of starting from basic physics stuff, because why we were doing this in the 90s, it was a spin-off of atomic clock research we were doing for fundamental symmetry tests. I won't bore you with all that right now, but it's again the serendipitous spin-off. If you're developing tools for basic physics, talk to people what else it might be able to do. This led one step after another, eventually into biomedical imaging, building our own systems and translating over to make portable MRI machines, right? So with
Very cool.
NVs, so that's our kind of complete story. It started way back then. It's now FDA approved, a public company, and you could go buy these portable MRI machines. So yay, NVs are maybe 2/3 of the way through that process. Got most of the basic physics figured out, did all those early application studies, rocks and bacteria and all these sorts of things that we've talked about earlier. Lots of improvement in technology, kind of getting pretty mature in academia in terms of the technology development with NVs, other people working on other defects that are interesting too. Companies already existing, getting traction, not as far along as the portable MRI machines in terms of that things, but coming, right? So you can see a similar sort of arc of start with the NV case. It started with people thinking about way back when gems, and then later quantum objects and solids and understanding the physics, and maybe you can use them for quantum computers, but maybe now it's better as sensors. And then it develops, find the applications, and the community. I'm just one person, right? The whole community develops this sort of thing, and it translates into tools for physicists and also through companies into tools for everyone as it makes sense.
If you can make a nanoparticle that has one NV center, what's preventing, quantum computers made with a number of these nanoparticles? Like, so what's preventing that from happening?
That's a good question. So let's think if we wanted to do that. So one, the nanoparticles themselves are not uniform in shape and size. Okay. So they're kind of like, they don't even look like boulders. They typically look like shattered shards of glass or something. So that's one.
That's a pure diamond nanoparticle.
Yeah. They're varying shapes and sizes. So that you'd have to make them if you could try to make them squares or whatever shape you prefer, they're very uniform. That'd be one challenge. Two, when you get the NVs created in the nanodiamond, and the nanodiamond is typically not super small, it's like 30 nanometers, 40 nanometers in size. The NV will be kind of random in its position inside. So the straggle, even if you got them regular, everything is exact perfect cube, and you had one nanocube after another nanocube. They're not, but if they were, even then the straggle would be on the order of 10, 20 nanometers inside. As I'm sure you know, dipolar interactions fall off. The interaction is 1 over r cubed, right? 1 over r cubed, right? Dipolar interactions, right? So 1 over r cubed, which is a very rapid fall off. 1 over r squared is for like point charge and stuff, but 1 over r cubed. So it's a very rapid fall off. And that means that if you are difference between being 10 nanometers away and 20 nanometers away is a factor of 8, nearly an order of magnitude, right? So if you have straggle that's on the order of the average separation, you'll have huge heterogeneity in the couplings. And say if I have a quantum computer made out of superconducting qubits, and the different couplings between my qubits is wildly varying, and I don't even know exactly what they are, those strange couplings, you're going to have a not very good quantum computer. So it's that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's exactly actually what I worked on during my PhD, was trying to, since it has like a pretty small dipole moment, like let's say comparing to Rydberg atoms when they can overlap like over large distances. But for Gauss centers, we try to increase the kind of interaction distances. As you said, it is pretty difficult to work.
So which color centers were you using?
NV centers.
Oh,
in
NVs. Okay.
diamonds.
Yeah. Right. I'm not saying it's impossible. There's just probably not going to happen just through more focus on doing the same old ways, like because of the straggle issue. But possibly it could be developed in other ways. So I'll mention a few looking forward. beyond diamond, right? You've got HBN, hexagonal boron nitrate, or other 2D materials. They can have defects in them too. So maybe you can make, and maybe they're more arrayed in a more normal lattice and you can layer them up. Also, people are developing NV-like systems in synthesized from bottom up in certain types of molecules. Dana Friedman at MIT is an example. You may want to speak with her. Peter Maurer at University of Chicago is doing interesting things in yellow fluorescent protein, a protein that's used in the life sciences typically as a way to label things and image and stain things, also used in optogenetics. Turns out that, I think, talk to Peter about this, some of the blinking behavior that's seen in some of those fluorescent proteins is actually the electron excitations getting off into a singlet side level that's analogous to what you have in NVs. And then, in fact, if you turn that around, instead of the blinking being bad, really what you're getting is the ability to do spin polarization and optically detected magnetic resonance in these things. If that's true and it works sensitive enough, you could synthesize proteins into all sorts of organic systems. And maybe even, not just for sensing, maybe synthesize the right kind of scaffolding, things that can be coupled to each other for quantum information processing. Mm-hmm. So the NV, you could go on the shelf of the Museum of Science someday as an early example of getting quantum out of the cryostats and out of the vacuum chambers and into a more robust material. But later comes even better materials that people find, or alternative materials that can be useful, that can be more chemically synthesized to do things that we'd like to do.
So on the side of like scaling up or like fabrication of diamonds and the defects, so how expensive are those diamond fields, and how do you see the roadmap towards maybe doing like a wafer level diamond growth?
Right. So currently, there's a few companies that make this, what's called quantum grade diamond with this pure enough, with low levels of paramagnetic impurities, and can put the NVs on average statistically where you'd like them. The best company probably that's been doing it the longest is in the UK, called Element 6, right? It's like carbon Element 6, right? And it's part of De Beers, and also has a growth facility in the United States, et cetera. But there's some other companies too. I've worked, and my colleagues have worked closely with Element 6 and some of these companies since the very beginning of the NV sensing field and before, to try to get the ideal diamond that we want. And sometimes we play a role, and the students do, in doing implantation or annealing, but often the companies can do a lot of it. It's still, however, a very boutique process. It's not yet at scale that you can order NV containing diamonds to be very reliably produced and delivered to you so that you can't tell one from another, right? Each diamond has very similar properties with an NV layer of some value, and the coherence times of the NV spins are spot on to several significant digits. They're all identical. Now, each one it's sort of like grandma baking cookies. You know, the cookies come out kind of the same, but one chocolate chip cookie is similar to the other chocolate chip cookie, but not exactly the same. And some are kind of funny shaped, and some are bigger and some are smaller. Not that bad, but these are the experts, because this growth process they're using is highly nonlinear. Any one variable can affect others, and and the annealing process too, et cetera, and the implantation process. And so there's a lot of work still to remain in the material science to make very reliable diamond plates and the nano-fabricated objects that you need for the sensing applications. What's done now is the world's best people can kind of statistically make things, and then after the fact, you pick out the good ones and discard the bad ones and use the good ones for your applications. And that's true in some of the companies too.
So it's a matter of the yield of having those.
The yield, right? And I mean, there's always a yield in something. If there was a 1 out of 1,000 bad ones or something, maybe you'd think that's pretty good. If it's about 50% bad ones, or 1 out of 10 is good enough, that's not so good. Not so good, literally. And so there's improvements needed there. It's not through lack of trying or whatnot. I think I've been told that what's needed to take semiconductors and other materials and do this early development to make them very reproducible and then scale them up it was needed in the silicon and germanium days back decades ago. And something like this would have to happen with diamond and these other materials. So it's a matter of sustained investment to solve all the problems that are necessary, lock down the procedures so you can have very reliable fabrication. Then you'd have to also, next step is, let's say you have that. The diamond plates, the diamond material is very reliable. The NB is very consistent. Then you want them integrated into the mechanical mounts, the optics, the microwave. You want it integrated subsystems, right? And currently what the companies, even the ones who are selling instruments, mine and others, are doing is, again, we have regular processes, but it's boutiquely made by experts one at a time. Right.
Does this make it hard to do biosensing? Because maybe you need like a disposable chip. I guess maybe there's like a disposable layer on top or something.
It does. At QDTI, that company there, one of the things that they've done is had to work closely with Element 6 to try to get as high a yield as possible, then cherry pick the good ones, and they'll have an assay, that's a container that'll have multiple wells on it. Each one might have a diamond chip, or they might have a few wells per diamond chip, so that the material that you're sensing can go onto the surface of the diamond. And you'd like all those diamond chips to have, and their NV properties to be consistent enough that you don't need to worry about one versus the other. I'm told, I haven't done these calibrations myself, that even when they get all the diamond chips are the good ones, they do have to go through and calibrate them to know the properties of chip number 1 versus 2 versus 3 versus 4, et cetera, so they can correct for those sorts of things. So that's kind of what you get that's why I said it's about halfway along the process of translating into technologies. Even when there is utility and people who don't care about quantum are willing to spend money to buy an instrument that can solve their problems, behind the scenes, it's still kind of a boutique, one at a time, craftsman-like product rather than something that can be made at scale. So there are challenges there. Yeah, I think that'll be true. Look, let's talk about over to the quantum computers. If somebody was going to place a big order for 1,000, Rydberg atom array quantum computers, or pick your other platform, and they don't care that 100 qubits is enough, but they really care that they're exactly the same. For some reason, they wouldn't do that. But if they did, if we really cared about reproducing exactly the same, it would be a bunch of work and a bunch of experts boutiquely making each one and calibrating things to make sure that they're exactly the same. They wouldn't have the processes to crank them out yet at scale because they haven't yet got to that stage, right? Even the different superconducting circuit elements they're having to work hard to make sure that they're all pretty uniform. Some aspects of that fabrication process, I'm told, are easier than others. It just tells you that quantum technologies are still in an early stage, and the engineering of quantum technologies of all sorts, sensing, computing, et cetera, is still in the early stage. Might be like early days of flight or something, where the Wright brothers are building their plane this way and other guys building his plane that way, and they're that kind of thing. They aren't yet cranking them out at scale.
I have a question about color centers. They essentially give like the color to the diamond, and I was thinking as a gift for my girlfriend to get a ring with a diamond. Is there a place where I can add some colors so that it could be like a cool you shine with a laser and you get some fluorescence effects?
That's a good question. Probably. Off the top of my head, since I don't think about the gem aspect that much, I can't go to Fred's Diamonds or something like this. But if you send me an email after the fact, and people listening to this, please don't send me the emails, but whatever. But I can connect you. I can try to connect you, perhaps some people I know, to figure out where we could do this, because I'm sure your girlfriend needs many jewels and wonderful things. I think it is true that the people fabricating, there's diamonds dug out of the ground, right? Natural. Then there's the ones which are fabricated in industrial facilities. They're the same carbon lattice structure as the natural diamonds. So there's no real difference other than they were made in a fabrication facility. Controlling the content of impurity atoms and defects like NVs, but other kinds of defects too, are important for color that they want to give. And yes, they do include various kinds of defects, probably NVs amongst others, to give bluish or pinkish or yellowish or other kinds of colors. Having one that not only, let's say, has a lot of NVs, but when you do just a little bit, and when you put a green laser pointer will really glow, that would be nice. We do some of those tricks with our scientific diamond chips, right? We take some of these diamond chips that may have a slight pinky purpley look to them, and when you put a green laser pointer through, it really glows kind of a bright reddish, pinkish, orangey color because of all the NVs that are there. And yes, color centers in diamond and in other crystalline systems, typically semiconductors, are given their name I believe, long ago, because it was determined that people knew some gems naturally had color. And then as you got through the late part of the 20th century, people using EPR, electron paramagnetic resonance, and optical techniques were figuring out that there were various forms of defects in various crystals, including diamond, that in certain cases gave color, absorbed certain wavelengths of light and gave off other wavelengths of light. It was in the late 90s when, as I mentioned at the beginning of our discussion, that Jörg Rocktrop and collaborators in Germany first identified and were able to detect a single NV. People knew about NVs were known. They were known to exist in diamond. People had studied them in various contexts for gems and materials properties, typically in ensembles, but there wasn't deep understanding yet of the energy level structure and the physics of NVs. And Jörg and collaborators were able to identify the NV as one single NV that you could see was through proper G2 measurements, was a single photon emitter. So it took, if you're getting one photon out, it takes a finite time before another photon can come out from that object, that single object, and could see that they could do the early stages of this optically detected magnetic resonance of a single NV. Again, I'm repeating myself, but it was a decade before the light bulb went on for a bunch of us to think about them as sensors. But at that time, they were quantum objects that people were interested in studying just to understand their physics, and then maybe as tools in quantum information processing, and also in, whether it's computing or networking and things like that. But the NV is not alone. I've repeated that many times, but there's a bunch of these defects. There's tin vacancies and germanium vacancies and silicon vacancies and all sorts of donor atom vacancy complexes, point defects, in diamond. There's also vacancy clusters and things where you get dislocations and all sorts of other kinds of corruptions to the lattice that both give color and in certain cases have these quantum properties. So the NV is the one at ambient conditions that's the winner for sensing in most applications.
Yeah, I have also heard that there was a story about finding extraterrestrial diamond from, I believe, meteorite in Russia.
Yeah.
How are the properties of that diamond different from what you can synthesize in the lab?
Yeah, I've heard that. I don't know. I don't know the story. I mean, I don't know the details of that story. I've heard that story. There certainly were special diamonds. There's the so-called magic Russian diamond that people have that was in the early days of fabricating diamonds for NV physics. There were these companies that we now rely upon to make high purity diamond with, let's say, very little carbon-13, which has nuclear spins that can give you a spin bath noise, right? Natural carbon is 1.1% carbon-13. So natural diamonds have 1.1% carbon-13. 1 out of 100 of the carbon atoms in the lattice has a nuclear spin, and they're processing in whatever magnetic fields are there. They're not doing it coherently, but it creates a background spin noise, which everyone was living with back in those early experiments. And so purifying the diamond by choosing the methane gas that you use isotopically purified in the growth process to not have the carbon-13s, to get to 3 or 4 or 5 nines carbon-12 was a major advance. Purifying the diamond to have very little paramagnetic electron spin type impurities except related to the NV creation was took years to make the diamonds better, and then hence the NV sensing properties. So in the early days, the few diamonds that were known to exist that had at least some NVs that had some good properties you could measure were shared amongst some of the groups. And in particular, there was one called the Magic Russian diamond that had particularly good properties. And I know that to say very nice things about the Stuttgart group with Jörg Rocktrop and Fedor Lechko. Lechko then became Professor Ulm. Were always excellent scientists and very helpful in the community, that they not only shared their technique, but often would share pieces of their diamonds. They did this with Misha Lukin and myself and others. And so you generally see this in this community. It's generally been a very functional community with open exchange of ideas and materials like special diamond samples. And students and postdocs that graduate from one group often go on and work in one of the other ones. So it's helped advance the field rapidly, that there's a bunch of people beating their chests and saying, only I know what I'm doing. All you other people don't know what I'm talking about. It's generally been a very healthy community, which is great.
So as I digged online about nitrogen vacancy centers, so I found that the first mention about it dates back to 1976. So it's been almost 50 years of research of this fantastic color center. And then, as you mentioned, like in 1997, from like early 2000s, there was a huge avalanche of the works on that. So what was that silence for almost like 20 years? Like, so someone found those color centers, then there was some silence. What is your take about like in general?
Yeah, so I wasn't working in the field. I was even like a teenager in the 70s, and so I wasn't active then, and I was not working on the NDs until this sort of like 2006 period, like I told you about. But I think there were, I believe there were the occasional studies going on throughout the 80s and early 90s. You can find a smattering of papers where people are typically doing bulk pieces of diamond that might have relatively large numbers of NV centers or other defects, characterizing them with usually a detection mechanism of EPR. So this is a way to detect the electron spin resonance that's coming from these defects or other defects, sometimes fabricating them different ways or changing their temperature or illuminating them with light. And there were advances in the understanding, but there wasn't a huge community doing it. And they were also building on not that much knowledge. So if you get a larger community and a lot more is already known about some of the basics, the next steps can get somewhat easier. And I think there was, from what little bit I've read of the literature, what I've been told, there were some debates in the community then with different models as to what the underlying energy level structure was and what appropriate groups some of the energy states belonged to. There wasn't yet the tools to determine a lot of these things, and especially if you're making ensemble measurements where you don't quite have control or knowledge what the ensemble makeup is, you can see why getting the single NV measurement becomes so important, because now you can start studying one of them and then study a second one by itself and a third under controlled conditions and start building up a from bottom up understanding of what's going on. There still took about 10-ish years from 97 to 2007, 8, that period, as I was entering the field was at the end of that period, with different hypothesized energy level structures, like the singlet state. Is it one state or are there multiple levels there? Now it looks like there's 2 levels. What are the branching ratios? What are the terms in the Hamiltonians that lead to various branching ratios for both radiative and non-radiative decay? Things like this that had to be worked out. You could have more than one model being compatible with the measurements to date, so you had to do more detailed measurements on specific questions. And there were a number of people like Neil Manson in Australia played a key role in a lot of this effort, and others figuring out the physics. Once you got the physics picture basically down, which maybe by 2007 or 8, most of the physics is understood, then people's creativity can start kicking in, particularly in the sensing area, and start building on an underlying model structure with some basic equations that can be used to think about what's possible. Think about what, we're fortunate as physicists. We've inherited a tremendous legacy of people of the past, 100 years ago with the birth of quantum mechanics, but a lot done in classical physics before then, that gives us a theoretical framework firmly based on extensive experiment that we can use and trust to reliably predict what will happen in a whole set of scenarios. Yes, we have to go control our experiments so that we don't have undesired effects going on. But as long as we do a good job there, we have the ability, we physicists do, to predict through equations a lot of what will happen. That's not often the case in other areas of science. The biologists do not have as extensive a mathematically based framework because their systems are just so complicated, right? From which they can predict as much. So they often have to resort to very detailed experimental replication processes, where before you can do a new thing, you have to repeat every step multiple times and show it works of everything that was done previously to get to that point, right? It's like you want to climb to a mountain and then go to the next hill on the mountain. We physicists have a map, so we know how to get to that place where everyone's gone before. A lot of these people are blindfolded and don't have the map, so they have to follow. Remember, 5 steps this way, breathe 6 steps that way. They have to follow these kind of like laborious procedures. It's not a criticism. It's just that physics is is simpler in many ways and more amenable to mathematical description. To get to that point for NVs took some time, I think the gap in time from the 70s to the 90s was not that there was no work. It just wasn't many people in the field. It wasn't seen yet as important. Once you get people interested in quantum systems, atoms, ions, superconductors, maybe these defects in solids can be quantum systems, because the momentum in the 90s starts growing, and in the early 2000s about engineered individual quantum systems and putting them together to make quantum machines of various sorts. You start attracting a greater community. They start making some progress. Ooh, these NVs are quantum objects at room temperature. Ooh, very interesting. Let's dive in. Many people get attracted, start figuring out what's going on. Ooh, as they figure out more, then eventually, like the sensing ideas open up to open up a whole new avenue of application. And I think a lot of it is that. That's how I describe it.
So that's what happened in 1997 when it was the quantum computing field was initiating, like, let's say, with trapped ions, all that.
And all the kind of quantum machines. People are already making clocks and sensors and thinking about repeaters for networks and quantum computers. Early days of thinking, how do we make a toolbox of quantum components that are not only individually quantum, because people are already done that in the 70s and 80s, looking at individual Rydberg atoms and things and other sorts of systems in microwave and optical cavities and all those things that are Bell's inequalities and whatnot. Now engineered to have two. You have Wineland and Monroe and others making a C0 gate, right? That kind of thing, demonstrating you can actually have a gate with two quantum objects that you can control interacting. Now, can we scale up and have 3 and 4 and 5? And what can we do with them? We can compute, we can simulate, we can measure or sense or image, we can couple and communicate or network. And so people were both interested in those applications, and also that attracts a lot of talented people to try to explore what are the diversity of systems where you can see such quantum effects. Obviously atoms, right? The right kind of atom, but even there was exploration of adding additional atoms that people would explore and understand better. And throughout the 80s and 90s, through laser cooling and trapping, being able to control their quantum states better, right? And obviously ions, but even there, pursuing different types of ions. Obviously superconducting systems, but even more there. These defects in solids, you can imagine maybe diamond's not the most scalable material, but imagine that you could actually make that checkerboard array of very nicely coupled regular quantum defects in silicon, right? Something like that. And it operated at room temperature. So a wafer scale, that's the dream. And if not, that's as close to that as you can get, right?
Yeah. So I should ask probably your craft of that question, but did they intentionally land on this nitrogen vacancy centers in diamond? Was it by accident? Like, what is there any story behind that 1997 work?
Yeah, Georg Graftrop has probably told me, and I don't remember. You need to talk to him about what. But I think there were some papers before that too, where he, as a young scientist, was interested generally in, and probably from his advisor, and you should speak with him about it, in studying optical properties of defects in solids. People were interested in it from many points of view, and but I would guess that likely this growing interest during that era in quantum properties in all reasonable systems, played a role in seeing you isolate one, and then is it a quantum object, or is it more complicated than that, right? Does it really act like a pseudo atom? It's an atom-like defect. Like I've said several times, these quantized energy levels, single photon emitter, et cetera, spin, all these kinds of things. That was probably in his mind, Gruber and the others who were involved in that measurement then.
And then at Harvard University, I asked you earlier that you mentioned that Misha Lukin somehow did he fall in love in diamonds. I'm just surprised that it didn't. I guess that the knowledge was available to the whole scientific community, but somehow it got a seat in Harvard, where it started to form the group of scientists. On this.
I mean, two primary reasons. One is Harvard's an amazing place with a lot of talented people who have different interests that can work together, and great students. But also Misha in a very particular role that, and offline, I've talked to you about this before, about having known him since when he was a postdoc. He's very good at seeing over the horizon, like what's the next smart thing to get involved, what are the opportunities before it becomes obvious to other people. once things come over the horizon, everyone can see it. But what's behind the hill? And he'd usually be, and I've seen this multiple times in his career, not only continuing and finishing and doing thorough work on the platforms that he and his group and collaborators are working on today, but appreciating their limitations and how they were unlikely to be the ultimate quantum tools, and therefore what is out there that maybe some other group is working on that could, with hard work and development, become an ultimate tool. Whether it be, and you want to be able to have controllable couplings and regular couplings. You want to have the coherence times be long. You want you want ideal quantum behavior. And if you can, in very simple apparatus and in, at accessible temperatures and conditions and all that. So, I believe as he was learning about the work that was going on late 90s, early 2000s with these room temperature defects in diamond being quantum objects, why not begin exploring that sort of thing? So he set up with his team an experiment. This time, when he first was hired at Harvard, he was in the physics department in 2001 or 2, he was hired as a theorist who'd work closely with experimentalists. He'd done a little bit of experimental work himself as a grad student, I believe, and he and I had collaborated on one of those first 2 stored light experiments that we did in warm atoms, right? That had come through our discussions over coffee and whatnot. And we had a setup in my lab that was already being used for EIT, actually coherent population trapping type rubidium clock, so we could tweak it and do those experiments quite easily. But then when he went to Harvard later that year to get his faculty position, he wasn't given a lab or anything because he was hired as a junior faculty theorist, right? So but he wanted to set up a lab, so he convinced people to let him use an unused office down the hall. It was an office, not a lab, and start moving some equipment in there. And he and I were collaborating on the next stages of this stored light-based stuff for making quantum repeaters and things like this. Soon, in parallel, working with Robin Coté, Sirach Zoller, and others, it had this Rydberg blockade ideas. And so on the back of his mind was to get there at some point. But he was thinking, I'm guessing what he was thinking about where are the other accessible quantum tools that we can use. Laser cooling and trapping systems, big and expensive, hard to set up. Rydberg atom arrays someday. These diamond systems, there's quantum behavior in room temperature systems, relatively simple. We can do some things there. We didn't have the lab space, remember, for this. So actually, John Doyle, our colleague and friend, who's now president of the APS, but who's another precision measurement person, lent and gave Misha and his students a corner of a lab space down in the basement of Lyman Lab in his lab. Also, that same kind of area was where the first sensing demos that we did in 2007, published in 2008, were done in a collaborative way down in that lab, because none of us had set up any of the NV things. Amir and I into our labs, we had labs, and Misha was kind of acquiring lab space. So I think the keys were, look at that, John Doyle lending lab space to us, right? Look at that. That's a collaborative community of interested people with different expertise and interests, but are willing to work together. Anku Park, Mark Alankar, Mir Kobe, me, Misha, others. And Roger Fu later in the Earth and planetary science areas, et cetera. And Misha's seeing over the horizon. And then and then Dima Vokir coming and asking the question. And it just makes sense, right? Quantum sensing makes sense. Take the capabilities that these systems give you and lean into it and pursue the science and the applications that they're well suited for. And be open to tacking and possibilities through interactions and collaborations with others. I think that's a good way to look at it.
Yeah. So I see that Misha's superpower was to envision over the horizon. What is your superpower?
I think I do combine focus that works focused and very thoroughly. I'm a precision measurement person to do a very careful job at things, but I'm also very open to these connections to go into new directions. I'm a physicist, but I always liked other areas of science and application too. So that's a combo where I can be very focused to finish a job, but I'm very open to collaborative opportunities that go into other fields. So whether it was some of the life science applications or electronics or the rock applications in Earth and planetary sciences with NVs, or the story I told you about spin-off of atomic clock technology becoming portable MRI machines or something like this, There's some other examples too. We developed laser frequency comb technology to calibrate astrophysical spectrographs to help search for Earth-like planets around other stars and other sorts of things. In my career, we've been like focused to do precision measurements and open to hopefully high impact, diverse applications. And to do that, you got to actually be interested in those applications. So I think that's, I think maybe what's a little bit special about me is the ability to both focus and be interested in diverse applications.
So by leveraging your focus and openness, if you were given unlimited funding, human resources as well, what kind of project would you do?
Ooh, that's a great question. Unlimited. Let's be realistic, because unlimited sounds like all the things. I think that if not for me, I'll start by saying this. I think, we're undergoing a lot of change now in the United States politically and in terms of how science is supported and stuff like this. So I'm not going to comment on that, but I'm going to say that one thing I've seen is a shortcoming in the way that scientific research is supported in the United States. I'm not talking about right now, I mean chronically for decades. It is very much focused on supporting projects only as opposed to supporting people. I think if you supported people, like students had support that went with them, and when PIs, professors get startup funds, sure, that lasts for a few years. But imagine that your typical researcher was getting support that was just a budget for their lab that's based upon were they productive over the last 5-ish years or so and have some vision for the future that could kind of support about half of what they do. And then they got to propose for project-based funding and things like this too. That would help in a lot of ways. It would help smooth out the fluctuations that come. It would let you plan more effectively. It would mean that people weren't having to chase fads as much of where it seems like the funding fads are. People could be freer to pursue things that really interest them. Now, the criticism could be, they'll just get fat and happy with their budgets and sit back and not do anything. So I agree that could happen. That's why you want to evaluate, were they productive over the last 5 years with the budget they had, that sort of thing. So that's one thing I do with the near unlimited funds is help support people and do this in a way that also encourages interactions so that people can find these kinds of connections, Another thing I would do maybe for myself in my own research area is I expressed earlier great interest and excitement about things that some other people are doing to find useful quantum effects in even more real world materials and even more real world substances, whether they be yellow fluorescent proteins or other kinds of things, chemically synthesized things. And by quantum effects, I mean not just atom-like point defects like NDs, can include that, but other kinds. It could be collective quantum effects, et cetera. So I think things which can think outside the box to find more useful and a more diverse set of quantum effects in more real-world substances, things that are soluble and organic and polymeric or whatever. Most people say, nope, that'll never happen because there's just too much interactions in such junky materials. All quantum effects will decay rapidly. I'd say, yeah, I bet that's usually true. But look at the NVs and look at what's happened in some of these other materials. There can be situations in which quantum, even in warm, messy materials, the quantum effects are protected and useful. And I bet it's not alone. I bet there's a lot more of that sort of thing that can happen. And so that would be an area.
What's the approach to look for that? Like, let's say somebody hypothesizes that the human brain contains something like this. How would you go about looking for that?
Yeah, I'd take some lessons from, one thing I do is take some lessons from how things have been discovered to date. So you can either do like forward, like synthesis, try to model and synthesize things chemically, probably, or in material science. The other is backwards, like find, like with the yellow fluorescent protein example or other sort of examples of things in areas of more real world like materials where they're chronically not behaving ideal in ways like blinking or other kind of funny behavior in currents. They're fluctuating or something. It could mean, often will usually mean some junky material process, right? Or something that's not going to be useful, but sometimes could mean that you've got some quantum processes there. So that's one thing. Another completely different area where I would get involved in, I'm going to blow your minds here because I'm going to change the subject to a different area of physics is I've been very excited for the last 10 or 15 years about, we published a bunch of papers in this too. It's not the subject of this podcast, I'll say it too, about using naturally occurring narrowband signals that can be quite stable. So like naturally occurring clock signals that are out there in the universe as probes of the universe, of things like what dark matter distributions are or other kinds of phenomena that you want to probe. So for as some examples, millisecond binary pulsars, emit pulses of radiation, and their pulsing in certain cases can be remarkably stable. As you go out to days and months and years, can be comparably stable to the best human atomic clocks. And we know where some of them are in our galaxy. So these are naturally occurring clock-like signals related to neutron stars. We humans didn't build them. And we have data records for decades going back, and we know where some of these objects are. So they're sending us clock signals, right? Well, how do we use clocks in our GPS network? We use them to navigate, to position, to get our position, et cetera. Well, to get our relative motion, we can learn about the gravitational potential profile of the Earth to space, things like this. So you can use these naturally occurring clock signals from millisecond binary pulsars to actually learn things about what the matter distribution is at kind of coarse scales in our galaxy. And we published a paper on this a couple of years ago, and we're able to, in one back analysis of publicly available data, get an independent determination of what the dark matter density was in our part of the galaxy, which was almost as precise as the sum total of all astronomical data acquired to date and consistent with it. So if it was inconsistent, you would have heard it would have been a big deal. It was consistent. Error bars like factor 3 times worse or something, but it's just one analysis of existing pulsar data. And it has very different systematics. The pulsar is out here. We here on the Earth are collecting the data. Pulsar is moving relative to us because it's moving in the galaxy, and so are we. It's accelerating relative to us. So that pulsar signal has a chirp on it. It's through that differential acceleration that we're getting information about the potential of gravitational potential of the galaxy. All the astronomical data people have gotten give them Doppler information. There's no dynamics in them. They have to use a model-dependent analysis to pull out what the dynamics are. They aren't getting the forces because they're not measuring the accelerations. So to get the gravitational distribution, potential distribution, which is related to forces, you have to use a model-dependent analysis, whereas ours is clean of that, doesn't depend upon that, because you're actually seeing the effect of accelerations through the chirp. So I expect, we've also done analogous analyses on what might be possible, looking at gravitational wave sources that are also narrowband. I expect there's a lot of potential, no pun intended, a lot of opportunity in narrowband clock-like signals that come from astronomical sources to learn a lot about fundamental physics. And I would help fund specifically acquiring much more millisecond binary pulsar data, because you need, these accelerations are slow, accumulate, the effects accumulate slowly. And so it's very good to have decades of data, but we only have decades of really high quality data on a few of the millisecond binary pulsars. And we don't know where all of them actually are that well. We kind of have coarse understanding where they are. So you need to know where they are and need a lot of data on them. So I do support a kind of effort at studying them extensively for a long period of time, and some other promising narrowband clock-like natural signal sources. And I think we could learn a lot about both galactically and extragalactically our galaxy and our universe by adding this kind of precision measurement approach to, they already have it, but this additional precision measurement approach to astrophysics. There's been a lot of discoveries in astrophysics over the last few decades that address fundamental physics questions, as you probably know, very different from most of what we're talking about today with quantum science and sensing. And I've been involved in that field somewhat too, and I think there's a lot more opportunity there. So there's a specific example. I put money into that. Millisecond binary pulsars, things like this, accumulating a lot of data as a function of time and localizing where they are, so we get these data sets.
Feels like you have an overarching theme of high precision measurement. So maybe like go into the prehistory of how did you get into this field?
I grew up in the U.S. in suburbs of the United States. I was really into science and stuff as a boy. I went to Duke University, got my bachelor's degree in physics there. I started working in a research lab second semester of my freshman year, and I I always liked as a boy too, like building and designing things. So I both like science and math. And I like built model railroads and electronic systems and things like this. So I was kind of well suited to be an experimentalist. And this lab I was involved with there had a wonderful man who was a professor. His name was Horst Meyer. He lived a long and happy life. He passed away in, I think, 2016, age 90 approximately. So he had a long life, but he was very encouraging to me as I was an annoying young guy, like any undergrad when they get involved in the lab. I spent 3.5 years in that group. They were a group studying transport properties in superfluid helium and in solid hydrogen. So it was quantum fluids and solids, old school 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s. When I was in college in the 80s, that was sort of the end of that era. But I learned some scientific rigor. I was trained in a lot of ways to fabricate things, et cetera. Then I went to Harvard for my PhD, and I worked with Ike Silvera, who was an excellent advisor too. And I was put on a project to develop a new type of atomic clock that would operate at low temperature, cryogenic hydrogen maser. So there was some reason to expect that hydrogen masers, which are very good secondary frequency standards invented by Norman Ramsey and Dan Kleppner circa 1960, and now widely used around the world, room temperature masers, you could make them even more stable by going down to kind of 0.5 degree Kelvin and having the hydrogen atoms come in and be contained inside a bulb that had superfluid helium coating the walls. So when we say low temperature, it's not laser cooling or whatever, it's old school cryogenics. We built a system, got it operating. In the end, it never became a better clock, but it got me introduced into this precision measurement world. And one of the things that I'll tell you this story, the thing I think that influenced me the most in grad school in a way was that I lost access to the dilution refrigerator that I needed to do my experiment for about 3 years. Right. So that sounds bad, doesn't it? Like if you lose access, sounds bad. It was actually one of the best things professionally that ever happened to me. How can that be? It was a great thing because, and it wasn't that someday I came and said, you're losing access to the fridge for 3 years. It seemed like it would just be a few months because there was one still fridge and there were multiple students who were putting their experiments in, and we were taking turns doing those various experiments. My cryogenic hydrogen maser had already worked at the kind of like first demo level where we get a paper out of it 2 years into grad school. Okay, go back, spend a year, rebuild it for the next gen system. The other couple students were going to go in there and do their experiments. Their experiments were more important in the group because they were about the race to get Bose-Einstein condensation, which is another whole story. This is before laser cooling and trapping and rubidium wins. There was actually in the 80s, the system that looked like it would first get VEC was spin polarized hydrogen at cryogenic temperatures. Their experiments were having trouble, not because they were bad students or anything like this. There was real physics behind it, which I won't bore people with, but it was more important that they do their things. And I was always waiting around to kind of use the dill fridge again. And 6 months turned into a year, turned into eventually like 3 years. So during this time, this is why it was a good thing, because in the end, that path on for BEC and the cryogenic hydrogen maser, I didn't know it then, wasn't going to become all that great scientifically. It was not the ultimate path to go in. I was kicking around without apparatus available to me to do the experiments I wanted to do. So that's a good thing. It made me, because I wanted to get something done. And I wasn't going to publish that many theory papers because I'm not that good as a theorist. But what I had access to was the room temperature hydrogen masers, the high quality, well-engineered room temperature hydrogen masers that existed in my secondary advisor, Bob Vesso's lab, that we were going to be comparing cryomaser I was building to. And those were just seen as clocks that you didn't touch, you just left alone. They're very good clocks. But I started thinking about things you might be able to do with those systems. So it's like what we've been talking about. You have a precision measurement capability. What can you do with it? And there's certain limitations put on you. I'm only going to be able to play and mess around with the system a little bit because they want to use them as clocks. So those constraints, no drill fridge, want to do science. There's the clocks available, but you can hydrogen masers, but you can only do little things to them. Put me in a certain box, which induced my creativity. And I came up with some ideas, like testing the linearity of quantum mechanics and being able to do some studies of spin exchange collision effects and looking at chaos that would occur if you modulated the masers in different ways. And so I came up with experiments to do that actually could satisfy the constraints. Interesting, publishable, get you a thesis, doesn't mess with the clocks too much, but takes advantage that they're there, that kind of thing. So that sort of set me on the course of think about what's available to you in your environment. Precision measurement is wonderful because it opens up, gives you such capabilities to look at things, but also think more broadly about what you can do with the tools you have. So see that theme, right? And similarly, as I started my own group, et cetera, down the road with the things that led to the portable MRI machine and the rubidium clocks that led to the stored light experiments, and later the NV diamond things that led to all this other stuff we've talked about today. It was develop the technology, but think broadly about what you can do with it.
Yeah. Is there, since we're close to wrapping up the episode, is there anything else we have not covered in the episode, what you would like to talk about?
I want to make sure that I've mentioned many names, but I want to make sure that any names I haven't mentioned, people don't get upset. There's been a lot of wonderful people that have contributed to all the things I've worked on, like those stored light experiments. The first author, David Phillips, is a remarkable scientist. He also played a key role in those laser frequency combs for calibrating astrophysical spectrographs relevant to the exoplanet work. He's at MIT Lincoln Lab now. The people who followed on the initial demos of NV Diamond that did a lot of those applications. I mentioned David Lesage, but there are many other people. There's Lynn Fong and David Glenn and Chinmay Belthangadi and Nirbar Gill and a whole bunch of other people that just in my group, and wonderful people that were in Misha's group and Amir's group, like Patrick Malatinsky, now professor in Switzerland, also has pioneered a lot of the scanning tip magnetometry work, and Mike Reynolds and lots of wonderful people, very creative students and postdocs and colleagues. So a nice thing, you guys have worked in some of the AMO and quantum adjacent fields. I think amongst the physics, in physics, I think these fields are quite holistic. The communities are pretty friendly. The people work together pretty well. And we also can always recognize that we learn so much from the people who came before us. We do our little bit and working with other people and then pass it on to the future. So I look forward to what people like you and others are going to be doing, and others who are out there pushing the state of the art of things, because it's wonderful to learn from other people. I enjoy learning things. Sometimes it's stuff I do, but usually it's things I'm learning from other people. And I enjoy your podcast too. I've watched some of them. Yeah. And some of the things that some of the people talked about, I was like there or knew about it at the time. So it's fun to hear the tales that people tell.
Is there any topic which you would be interested to learn about in the upcoming episodes?
Yeah, you should. I mean, you're doing a great job, I think, of interviewing people who are of a certain age, shall I say. Usually all over 50 and often over 60 or 70. And that's great because we can look back and talk about these things. It might be also interesting to talk with some of the folks who are already like PIs and professor types, but in their early mid stages of their career. It gives a different perspective. Not only can they look back a little bit, but look forward more. If they're 38 or 45 or something like this, there's as much going forward as back. So I think there's a lot of people in your community at MIT and Harvard and other places to talk to there and talk with there. I mentioned some of the names, but they're involved with the MP work, like Paolo Capolero, who's there at MIT, and Norm Yao now at Harvard, and other sorts of people. You could get like Marco Longhar's perspective on many different things, not just the diamond work, but things he's done in lithium niobate. I'm sure has wonderful tales to tell about all sorts of interesting things. I could come up with lots of names. That's one. Another, here's something from left field. You might want to talk to some of the people at MIT that have spun out into like a very different thing, like into fusion, Commonwealth fusion systems. It might be interesting to hear the physics that underlie that and what people think could happen. Just an idea.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this was great. I think the only question sometimes we like to ask is just if you were, like for people that are just getting into science, or maybe just, getting into academia, let's say exiting their PhD and looking to get into research, or even looking to start startups, whatever it is, like do you have any advice? Or like,
Especially in the current conditions, right?
yeah, I mean, I don't know if they're really that different, but it's, do you have any advice for like what you would do if you were 30 today and or 20, 30 today and just getting into things?
Yeah, when I was coming out, got my PhD in 1991, there wasn't a lot of hiring in academia. I stuck around at the same place I'd gotten my PhD, kind of at the Harvard Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics, and was fortunate enough to have people who gave me opportunities there. Developing your own voice scientifically of what the way you like to do things and why, I think is a great thing. You asked me about mine, is maybe this focus and openness or something like this. And with Misha being able to see over the horizon and caring very much about building quantum systems, for each young person, developing their own scientific voice, what they want to pursue and learn about, is an important thing. Trying to fit into somebody else's mold will only work so far. Now, that doesn't guarantee you some plum position in academia. It is a bit of a crapshoot always, right? And there's pros and cons to staying in academia. Look at the changes going on now. So that's one thing. How do you develop your own voice? Learn from others, but learn what you like to do. And that might change a little bit at different stages in your life. But, there's this one person you don't want to lie to, and that's yourself. Like, just know what you really care about and figure that out, right? And then pursue that. I'd also say it could mean changing. So it can mean changing fields. You don't have to stay in the same field. It could mean doubling down and staying in a field. The thing that gives you where you think you thrive the most, your own voice. Be absolutely open to startups. That was less common back when I was getting out of grad school. There was typically, you thought, there was old school Bell Labs, big companies and things like this. You had some government labs and you had academia, or leave science altogether, that kind of thing. But I think there's much more opportunity in startups. Also, it's, of course, much more friendly to and open to younger people being in senior positions or being in positions where they can help determine their own future than and institutions that have been around a long, long time, like academia, aren't going to evolve, and they have, towards a hierarchical structure in which you slowly move up a hierarchy. Nimble, newer institutions don't have as much traction like a startup. They're more fragile. They could go away, but they do absolutely give you the ability to have more self-determination. And it's a way to have a lever arm on the future and that sort of thing too. And I think it's also, I'd say, less uncommon than it was for people in academia to say, oh, you left academia and went off to startup and did something else, you can never come back. It's less of a one-way street, a diode. Increasingly, and I'd say that's even more so true if you get to like engineering and applied sciences than the basic sciences, but even in physics, people who've done interesting things in government, in companies, in startups are seen as quite open, increasingly open to them coming into academia. So sometimes people can do interesting things, let's say in their 30s, and by the time they want to go into academia, they could be in a position of having accomplished a lot, be more of their personal life set, and be more financially secure, and maybe even hop right into a tenured position or something. I think that's and we're talking about quantum here today, mostly quantum sensing, but in general, the large quantum industry, quantum computing more than anything else, there's so many job openings that's probably going to continue, that I would expect to see people over time coming back to academia who spent 5, 10, 15 years doing cutting edge work in one of the major quantum companies and taking a pay cut because they made a lot of money there and they come back, but that's okay. Does that make sense? You guys agree? What do you think?
Yeah, I think the problem you mentioned about funding being project based is very real, especially like, I mean, in academia. Like, I think typically I don't know how it was in the past, but like their grants are often looking for like applications and fundamental science at the same time, which I think is actually like produces mush in a way, because most fundamental science doesn't have any applications and people have to pretend. And it's kind of like, I think that's some of the issues that like face people if they're just, getting into academia today, is that you're stuck with this, like, when you read grants, it's like all this nonsense. Basically, you have,
Leave applications for startups.
Yeah, and it I think that does drive some people to work in startups, I think that's which might be healthy, right? Like like at least there's like a pressure relief valve in a way. Like that's probably one reason why I'm at a startup versus academia is just a little bit more straightforward. Like the funding is connected to something I understand. There's not a lot of like mixture of like I don't feel mixed feelings about what's getting funded or whatever. It's pretty straightforward. But yeah, I think uh people have more of a stomach for grants. I think it's important, like get to do basic science, and that's also really important. So it's kind of just a decision people have to make. But it's a tough one. It would be nice if it wasn't like that. And funding people makes a lot of sense to me.
You're still going to choose who gets at all, even gets such a position. I'm not saying it's a panacea, but if I had a lot of money, like I was told, unlimited reason, or at least a very large amount, that's some of what I would do. You need to free people up. Now, some people may not thrive, but others will, I think, thrive and be able to do what they want to do and be a little more honest, like you were saying. Look how the people sometimes say to me, "Oh, wow, you've done these things and they've turned into companies." And in the case of the portable MRI stuff, it's really helping people and really exists. But it's a long haul. It wasn't just me. It was a lot of people, A, and B, it's a long haul. It's usually multi-decade. And most things that you think are going to be, even if you honestly think them are going to be impactful, maybe turn out to have a shortcoming and are not. So there's going to be many false starts and dead ends. Similarly, in basic physics, it's hard. Only occasionally were you able to like take publicly available data like we did with the pulsars, analyze them in a pretty straightforward way, and almost do as well as the sum total of the community's effort on figuring out what the dark matter density is. That's how can that be possible? It's because nobody had thought in those terms before, and that's because you don't have this. Not that we're such geniuses, it's an obvious thing. It's just, in hindsight, it's just crossing fields and thinking about things differently. Imagine if you had a bunch of people who didn't have to hype and BS things up and weren't channeled to only work on the problems that are the ones that can get funding, especially when they're young, when successfully getting funding is essential to get the students, postdocs to help you do the work so you can get the paper so you can get tenure, blah, 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 right? It's a feedback loop that creates mode locking on a few accepted areas, right? Now, you want some concentration of people in exciting areas, sure, but you want people to be able to explore and do their own thing. That's why I say develop your own voice. It's hard if the resources aren't there. A little bit easier for a theorist, but of course, people often don't, ironic, that people in physics actually don't take most theorists as seriously. In hindsight, we lionize theorists of the past, but in fact, most theorists at a given point in time, people don't take us. Not that they're, if you understand what I mean, it's not that they aren't serious people. It's just their calculations usually don't bring as much merit in most cases or weight in most cases as some well-done experiment. And experimental physics, any science is hard. Equipment, you're in universities, you have a training role that you're doing of training young people how to do things. And by the time they become quite proficient, they're usually leaving. We don't have this layer of staff scientists and engineers that might make more sense in addition to professors, students, and postdocs to help. So that's another thing I might fund as well as people is fund a layer like that where there's well-paid, secure career positions and many of them for people to be various forms of scientists, engineers, technicians in academia, another kind of layer.
Absolutely agree. I also have just like an insight from being in academia for like 15 years. So what I see is, as you mentioned, like a lot of load on professors. So I feel like that kind of a lot of distractions. Like you need to participate in this committee, you need to secure funding. The probabilities of winning a grant is very low. You need to submit a lot of grants. So there is a lot of things which kind of distract from the focus. So, and I think those who can like fully focus on the projects, or at least like one major one, that would succeed. And I see like in the startups, that's environment which potentially is supposed to give like that capability to focus on the problem, like let's say for something like 5 years or so to kind of either develop the product or something else. And I don't know. I see this trend even starting from while working with high school students, because when they would come, I would do like essentially like on my spare time, like supervise some of the projects, and then they would come to me and I would tell them, okay, so you need to do one small thing, but do it very well. But what I see, like for the college applications, they're trying to do like, become reach some results by being a sportsman, like a volunteer in this club, volunteer in that club. So it kind of starts from the early age where you need to be in so many different ways, like a huge talent instead of just doing one thing right.
I agree with you. I think there's a kind of like social cultural ADD or something that's encouraged to extend resumes with
Yeah.
many things that, if you don't think too hard, sound impressive, but in fact, none of them, they were all done fairly shallowly. I see that too. And you're right. Professors are used as middle managers in most universities with a whole bunch of administrative and committee-based tasks. Some of us are good at getting out of some of those, but the reality is the universities run on that. It's not just getting the money, but then administering all the bazillion things that come with it. If you've got a big enough group, maybe you can hire some people, the university gives some people to assist you. But in most cases, that there's some bandwidth that's needed of the professor to focus on these things. Otherwise, things go awry. Plus all these committees that are needed to run things, both for your university and for the community, collective. So it's you do want collective input. You want everyone to have a voice, but it chops up people's attention into a bazillion pieces and focus goes away. And how can you be creative and really get a lot done? Even if one that is creative, another thing is just execution. Those aren't always the same thing. Detailed execution so that a calculation, an experiment is done well, that data is analyzed properly. The paper is written very thoroughly and very carefully to have all the right details, and you check and make sure things are right as best you can. There will be occasional mistakes, but if you chop people up into a million pieces, they're not paying attention, both the students and the professors, it's not going to be great. So that's a lot of it is that. It's not, a lot of that. Startups, on the other hand, yes, we mentioned some pros. I've also seen cons, in addition to insecurity, because, we never know what happens and monies go away, or you just, even though the idea sounded good, it doesn't work, even with all hard work. Often, not always, things have to be hyped up too to get the resources. The investor types typically want to be told a story about how their sums of money are going to, in a few years, not just make them rich, but make them fabulously rich. Or, so you have to exaggerate. It's a different kind than you were talking about, Michael, right? But there's exaggeration that can occur there, not always, but often. And it's driven by the people funding things. Now, we sound like, to some degree, me especially, because I'm a tenured professor, whiny complainers of people who are very, very privileged, and all this money comes from taxpayers and other sorts of people. So I want to say, I understand. I'm just trying to figure out how to let smart, passionate people do science, technology development, translation in an effective way. And in today's world, it's not the worst, but it could be better.
I mean, one thing that's a glimmer of hope is maybe just that the boomers are finally aging out of things. And I feel like, I just feel like the boomers had it pretty good and therefore don't want to change most things. And I do think that a lot of people's frustrations come. This is just my bias.
I was born right at the end of the baby boom in 1962, or the second to last year, that sort of thing. So I agree, and I think even as a younger boomer, I can see the sweeter deal the older boomers had. There were 10 to 15 years, as long as they didn't have to go to the Vietnam War or something like this. You can tell the stories, the price of housing when they were in whatever job they had in 1976, all that sort of stuff. It was easier in a way. And then they get holier than thou and tend to wag their fingers at people and all the rest. So yes, I think and not retire.
Yeah, I just think bigger changes are possible at some point once. It's just always generational. Like, a lot of these systems just worked really well. I mean, they worked amazingly well. We got so much got done, during the Cold War, amazing research and everything. And that's,
especially
I guess,
Bell Labs.
Yeah, Bell Labs. I mean, there's so many examples of amazing things that have happened, that I think that there's a lot of, you can say, to defend the system, right? So it's probably more of a generational thing for people to come in and kind of say, okay, these particular things, we want to change them a little bit. So maybe over the next 10 or 20 years, we'll see some of the things that stopped working at some point, because I mean, part of it is the thing where once you have a metric, people optimize to that metric. It used to be a good metric and it no longer is. I mean, H-index is a funny one, right? Like, but you can think of others. And so I think it's probably just generational where you get like a, but you know, in the meantime, I think people just, you know, work their way around it. But it's but we'll see, like in the next 10 or 20 years, maybe some of these frustrations will just go away. Like people will rethink, you know, like, so like what you're suggesting is not like the funding people, not projects. That's not controversial. Like I feel like
No, it's not unique to me.
yeah,
Many people
exactly.
say this.
I've heard that many times. So I think it's just a matter of the people who say this finally getting in the position to do it, you know, like that's pretty much the, which I think is just the time. It's just like a slow process.
Certain countries do provide levels of base support in certain cases. There's all sorts of differences between how different nation states do it, with pros and cons in each case. I'm sure right now the United States, we're going through all sorts of turmoil. We'll see what happens. And hopefully we can stabilize and just all look out for a healthy community. Try to take care of the younger people and the people who are less advantaged, to make sure, you know, I'm concerned personally about people I know who are either on visas, let's say from less favored countries, but are doing everything properly here. You know, they're going to make sure that we like don't have travel, just stay, do your work, that kind of thing. There are people I know who work for the federal government who might be let go because of various kinds of probationary types of things. So we've got to help some of those people get landing spots so they can get a few months of employment while they find their next gig, as they say, because people usually have, especially if they reach a certain point, they've got families and things like this. So it's a challenge to sticking together and trying to figure out how to make things better is good. And I agree, boomers, yeah. My kids say that to me. They're all like in their 20s. They say, "Okay, boomer, yeah."
Okay.
So there you go. That's my recommendation to you guys. Don't just interview boomers.